to arrive at this incredibly significant, almost emergency summit. Now, of course, this summit was in the diary, but given the events of Friday, the disastrous meeting between Donald Trump and President Zelenskyy, that confrontation that took place in the Oval Office on Friday, very unexpected, about 40 minutes into what turned into a press conference, we saw the two men clash, with Donald Trump saying that you are tempting World War III here. They described Volodymyr Zelenskyy's attitude as disrespectful to the Oval Office, to the American people. It was supposed to be followed by lunch. The Ukrainians were virtually thrown out. That meeting was cut short. The all-important minerals deal that the two sides were supposed to sign, which would allow the United States to have a stake in this conflict in Ukraine, was not signed. So things are up in the air, and European leaders arriving here at Lancaster House are now in repair mode. Now, a short while ago, as I said, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, was seen arriving here at Lancaster House for that international summit. And in the past 15 minutes, he's welcomed French President Emmanuel Macron. You can see that on your screen now. And Keir Starmer has been outlining how the two countries will play a role in what happens next. Have a listen.
We've now agreed that the United Kingdom, along with France and possibly one or two others, will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting. And then we'll discuss that plan with the United States. So in those calls on Friday night, through the meeting yesterday, into the calls again last night, I think we've got a step in the right direction because, as I say, nobody wants to see what happened on Friday, but it's really important that we keep our central focus, which is lasting peace in Ukraine.
Well, that was the Prime Minister speaking a little earlier, but with me now is our political editor, Beth Rigby. And Beth, I mean, you were in DC with the Prime Minister last week. That went incredibly well. I mean, what happened on Friday was an absolute disaster. And while this summit has been in the diary for some time, I mean, there is a sense of massive urgency now.
I think there was a sense on Friday night and into Saturday of despair, the meticulous planning that Europeans had been putting in since President Trump became the incumbent in the White House had been blown apart by what happened, those scenes between President Zelenskyy and Donald Trump. I mean, the Europeans had understood that they needed to step up defence spending, had understood that they needed to make offers on peacekeeping troops, and you saw that with President Macron, the words he said, and then Keir Starmer, President Macron, to the White House on Monday, carefully orchestrated, sharing notes with Keir Starmer, who then went on Thursday, and it was all designed to build up to this moment where Europeans would say the minerals deals has been signed, President Trump with Zelenskyy, we have agreed on defence spend increases from other partners and on peacekeeping troops, and these were the components that they could then package up that President Trump could then perhaps take to President Putin in terms of negotiations. And as you said, it all blew up on Friday night with those awful scenes between President Zelenskyy and President Trump. Zelenskyy ejected from the White House, the deal off. What's happened since then is a couple of things. That firstly, there's been frantic diplomacy behind closed doors. So the UK government hasn't been giving readouts on what's been going on, but there were two calls to President Trump from Keir Starmer, one on Friday, one on Saturday, a call between Keir Starmer and President Macron on Saturday, and now those leaders have agreed that they will lead a peace process, or peace discussions at least, with European leaders, which they will then put to, and I'm sorry I'm distracted because someone's coming and we're obviously going to have to shout at them, but that they're trying to put together this deal.
Let's just have a look at who's here. If we can pan the camera around, I think they've got, okay, we've got a shot of that and see who's here. I mean, Beth, dignitaries are starting to arrive here at this all-crucial meeting. What I will say, and, you know, I'm just waiting to see who comes out of the car.
It's Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland. Donald Tusk there, who, he seems to have done something to his leg. Maybe had a skiing accident or something, but Prime Minister Starmer coming out. And of course for Poland this is particularly acute because they are bordering Ukraine. Donald Tusk, can you make progress today, sir? Can you make progress today, sir?
Yeah, quite an injury there. Beth.
Yeah.
As you say, I mean, for Poland, they not only bore the brunt of the refugees fleeing Ukraine at the beginning of this conflict, but they know all too well what it means for a emboldened Russia. They've been gobbled up in the past as a nation, and they, fear that more than anything. And of course, they are the border that is NATO. The fear is that the conflict could pour into NATO.
Yeah, and I think the aim of today is to get the process back on track. And when I've talked to government sources who've been very tight-lipped over the weekend, this has all been behind-the-scenes diplomacy. The Prime Minister genuinely trying to act as a bridge between the European allies and the President of the United States. Donald Trump does not seem to curry much favour with the European Union at all, and we saw that in some of the remarks he made, saying that the European Union had been constructed to screw the US on trade, threatening tariffs. Keir Starmer clearly has a much better relationship with him, and what's going on is Keir Starmer is trying to act as the bridge. My sources in government think that they can get the process back on track. They tell me that they think there will be ups and downs, but they need to focus on the bigger prize, and the bigger prize is trying to get together a plan for ceasefire negotiations, but it is going to require the European partners to step up, and that's not just in words, it's the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. Secretary General, can you make progress today, sir? NATO allies need to step up defence spend, sir, don't they? I mean, Yada, what I was actually told in Washington when we were behind the scenes was that there are two things going on here. Donald Trump, and this was before the Zelenskyy blow-up, but Donald Trump is not going to put in US security guarantees without seeing that Europe is stepping up, and that is hard power of military might. That is defence spending, and that is potentially troops on the ground. Keir Starmer understood that, made both those offers before going to Washington, but equally the Europeans are not going to put their men and women on the ground as peacekeeping forces if there is not a US security guarantee. So this is a chicken and egg. And as you were saying about the concerns of those borders with the borders with Ukraine and the countries on the eastern side of Europe closer to Russia, they don't trust Putin to keep his word. So what was really interesting in the White House was when President Trump was asked about whether he trusted Putin to and take him at his word. President Trump, and you'll have heard this, repeats all the time, he's not going to mess with me, I trust him to respect me as the president, and if I'm in Ukraine with business interests, he's not going to break the contours of a peace deal. But the Europeans do not believe that, and the Prime Minister this morning said, I do not trust Putin, that's why we need security guarantees. And so this is the diplomatic dance, if you like, that is going on. I think the first thing in the first instance is that they need to get Zelenskyy to sign the deal, which they're hopeful of, and Trump to come back to the table. But the big material change is that you would have expected the US to lead this process. That is historically what the US has done for decades, since the Second World War. They have been the country that has led the Allies. And now what you're seeing is a UK Prime Minister with a French President who is now saying we will put together the deal and put it to Trump. The other thing that's interesting is the Prime Minister said this morning that it would be him and Macron and one or two others. And then Prime Minister Meloni has come out from Number 10 and said that they think Italy can also be a bridge. And of course, Meloni has a very good relationship with President Trump. So it might be that Italy now steps in as well with France and with the UK. But I think that this is another day of diplomacy, and I think we're going to see a number of days like this, Yalda, in the coming week or so, as the Europeans scramble to put together a deal and then try and win Trump back around, and that will depend on Zelenskyy too. But also there is a growing understanding and admission, I would say, amongst certainly in the UK and other European leaders, that they need another option. They need a plan B. They need to be prepared to try and defend Ukraine and defend a potential ceasefire without US support. And that is a massive strategic shift for countries that banked a peace dividend at the end of the Cold War, have not invested in defence, have spent money on welfare and education and health, and now they are finding them a viable ally in the US and trying to understand now what that means. And that will actually have implications for all of us, because that can really materially shift defence spending and priorities for governments, not just in London and the UK, but across Europe.
Beth, before I go to Deborah Haynes in Kiev and get analysis from Dominic Waghorn, this has been a really good week for the Prime Minister. I mean, he has appeared like the grown-up in the room. We saw him yesterday with President Zelenskyy come out. Yeah. He rang Donald Trump. Now, as you say, he, alongside President Macron, are going to try and be the bridge that lead this peace deal, then take it back to the President. Essentially, the UK is now in this very crucial geopolitical position.
I mean, and we should note that even 2-3 years ago, after Brexit, the UK felt like a bit player on the side of Europe, which was a big bloc, and then the US under Biden. And yet the Prime Minister has now emerged as a key negotiator for Europe when he's not even the country's not even part of the European Union anymore. And what I would say about Starmer is he understood, I think, early on what he needed to do to find common ground with Trump. They're not natural bedfellows. He's a Labour politician. Trump's a Republican. They, personality-wise, are completely different types of people. But Keir Starmer's also a pragmatist, and he's worked out what he needed to do. They've done months of groundwork. Calling President Trump after his assassination attempt was a smart move. Trump works on personal relationships, and it has worked for Keir Starmer. He's not flashy. He doesn't try and posture in front of the president. He almost takes a sort of secondary role by being privately firm behind closed doors. And yeah, he's emerged as this peace broker. I don't think Number 10 at the beginning of the year would have expected that this is where he would be. But with a president that does not like European allies as much as previous democratic presidents have, does not like the European Union, Keir Starmer is emerging as this bridge builder. And if he can pull it off, I wonder how that will affect the public's view of him here at home, because he's had a difficult start to his premiership. But he really is, sometimes, you know, they call it meet in the moment, and he really has stepped up. And the question now is whether he can keep that going, and that does require all the diplomacy he's got in him.
Yeah, absolutely. Beth, thank you so much for all of your analysis there. We're keeping an eye on the situation here, all the arrivals. We will be coming back to you shortly, but thank you so much for now. Well, let's bring in our Deborah Haynes, who joins me live from Kiev, and to get more analysis from Dominic Waghorn as well, our international affairs editor. I'll come to you first, Deb. So just listening there to Beth, some of the analysis, the position that the British Prime Minister has now found himself in, but just give us a sense of how the Ukrainians are now feeling. No doubt this has been an incredibly tense, difficult, stressful period for the Ukrainian president, for his entourage that have been travelling from the United States. They were essentially thrown out early. They've arrived here in London to the embrace of the British Prime Minister, and now for the start of this summit.
Well, there was that image, wasn't there, of the Ukrainian ambassador to the US with her head in her hands as that exchange unfolded, that explosive exchange unfolded in the Oval Office on Friday. You can only imagine the kind of conversations that then took place after the meeting, as Volodymyr Zelenskyy was unceremoniously told to leave the White House. I mean, it's absolutely extraordinary. And then flying to safe arms, the safe arms of the British Prime Minister in those scenes that we saw yesterday with that really warm embrace that Keir Starmer gave to Volodymyr Zelenskyy. You can only imagine that he would have felt very comforted by that from what must have been a pretty shocking encounter with Donald Trump. But then again, this is a president who has been at war, with his neighbour for the last 3 years in terms of the full-scale invasion, having to deal with, you'll remember in that first day, the Americans saying to him, "Do you want a ride?" and him saying, "I need bullets, not a ride." He has withstood far more extreme and deadly pressure from the Russians than he got from Donald Trump. Yet, of course, it's the shaking of the entire foundation of transatlantic security that has been the earthquake under Ukraine this week, and also, of course, across Europe. For the Ukrainians, though, they are resilient. They're defiant. They are not wailing in despair from the scenes on Friday. Far from it. They say they have no choice but to keep on fighting. Of course, it will be horrendously more difficult, far more difficult, without American support. Some say impossible, but this country is not about to surrender in defeat. They are looking to the Europeans for that support they might find Europe wanting in terms of its actual capability to support. Yes, of course, in the words and the language and the intent, but that is not the same as hard metal, hard weapons. And since they have been disinvesting in defence since the end of the Cold War, unfortunately, the cupboards are fairly bare, including in the UK. The UK has spent the last 3 years, let's not gloss over this, the UK has spent the last 3 years as a leading country supporting Ukraine, giving everything they possibly could in terms of ammunition, those anti-tank missiles, tanks, the artillery pieces, all of the weapons that the UK readily gave to Ukraine in its hour of need, but then fundamentally failed to find the additional investment back then when this crisis first blew up on Europe's doorstep to reinvest in Britain's own stockpiles. So right now, the cupboard is fairly bare. And yes, Keir Starmer is taking this leadership role, which is traditionally the one that the UK holds as a nuclear-armed nation, a leading member of NATO, a member of the Permanent Five member of the UN Security Council, and yet it needs to really change its mindset if it wants to be able to match its words with deeds and give Ukraine the support it needs for the long run, and Europe the leadership it needs if the US really is in retreat.
Yeah, Debs, as you say, a really difficult moment, not just for the transatlantic relationship, but of course for Europe as they think about smart ways to up their defence spending. We've already started to see the arrivals. As I said, the French President Emmanuel Macron arrived here first and was greeted by Sir Keir Starmer. We have been seeing European leaders starting to arrive. This summit is going to officially start in about 40 minutes' time. So for the next 40 minutes or so, we will be seeing the European leaders as well as the Canadian leader arrive here at Lancaster House for this crucial meeting, a roundtable that will take place, this summit, where the UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, alongside the French President Emmanuel Macron, will essentially be leading the drive on a plan, a three-phase plan we're hearing, where they will try and put that together alongside the Ukrainians, and then they'll be taking that to the Trump administration. We still don't know what is going to happen in terms of the relationship between the United States and the Ukrainians. But let me bring in our Dominic Waghorn, who joins me now. And Dom, this is a difficult moment, as I said, for transatlantic relations, for the people of Ukraine. We got the view there from Debs about how the Ukrainians are currently feeling. You've covered the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. I've been on the ground covering the war. The one thing I will have to say about the Ukrainian people, they remain resilient, although this next phase will be incredibly difficult for them.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing, Alda, there's a huge amount at stake, and there's a lot more at stake than just Ukraine. And to say just Ukraine, obviously, is an understatement. Ukraine is a hugely important conflict, and what happens in Ukraine will affect the rest of the world for a long time to come. But what has happened over the last few weeks, and particularly the last few days, has been seismic in what it might mean for the way the world is run, the way the world has been run by the West for 80 years since the Second World War. And that has been based on the idea of rules with some egregious exceptions. The West has tried to impose rules. So if you attack a neighbour, if you invade a neighbour with unprovoked aggression, you get punished. If you try and destabilise the world, you get punished. And there's an attempt to keep things stable and secure and prosperous. The fear is now we have a president who seems to have no patience for that, and the organisations that underpinned it and the philosophy behind it. What Donald Trump seems to believe is effectively the survival of the strongest, certainly in the minds of sceptics and critics. And the fear is he seems to prefer resetting relations with another strong partner like Russia, potentially also China, and has contempt for weaker partners like Ukraine. And I think that impression has been reinforced massively by what we saw in the Oval Office at the end of last week. Whether or not, whoever started it, whether it was an ambush or not, the fact that the Vice President and the President continues to pummel and lay into this key ally, I think is reinforced in the minds of many their greatest fears. I think for European leaders meeting where you are, the worst case scenario is America under Donald Trump has effectively switched sides. It certainly has diplomatically. We saw it do that in the UN in a vote last week. To the shock of many, might it do so in different ways? That is a very live concern, I'm sure, for European leaders. The best case scenario is that America does seem to have become a rogue nation under Donald Trump. Either way, as Beth was saying there, it's not a reliable partner, and if it's not a reliable partner, it can't be relied upon to guarantee security in Europe, as it has been for 8 decades, and it can't be relied upon to enforce and underpin peace in Ukraine. So Europe has a huge challenge, and is Europe up to that? Is it up to it in a military sense and a political sense? So that's the challenge, I think, for leaders meeting where you are in Lancaster House. Can they show they have the ability to come up with a lot more defence spending, the kind of military muscle behind the new role that Europe might need to have if they are on their own in this new world order? And that's potentially a very live concern for them. But the implications of this, I think, are far-reaching. All the way to here, we're in Kisumu in Kenya. And another sort of outcome of the new Trumpian philosophy in Washington has been the cancellation of US aid. That has been a projection of soft power for America for decades. They have been brilliant at using soft power to extend their power and influence. But Donald Trump has cut all US aid. So to give you an idea of what that means here in Kenya, $850 million worth of aid has been given to Kenya every year. That effectively overnight was almost completely cut off. So we've been talking to health workers in tears, mothers with HIV weeping over their children, saying they have no idea what's going to happen next. And they are saying that thousands, tens of thousands could die here potentially in the coming weeks if there isn't a change of heart in Washington. So just to bring it back to Britain, we could have a scenario where Donald Trump goes to the palace, Buckingham Palace, for the state visit in a few months' time, at a time when tens of thousands of people are dying and have died because of what Donald Trump has done to US aid. So, you know, this is a completely new way of the world operating, has enormous ramifications, and the aftershocks of what happened in the Oval Office last week and from what we've seen in Washington over the last few weeks are potentially enormous, not just for Ukraine and Europe, but for the rest of the world as well.
Yeah, Dom, as you say, we're all watching incredibly carefully to try and make sense of what this next phase will look like, both for the United States as well as Ukraine and for Europeans who have come here for this all-important meeting. Dom, thank you. We'll leave it there with you for now, and no doubt we'll be speaking to you again throughout the day. But joining me now is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Elizabeth Braw. Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. No doubt you and those who are looking at the transatlantic relationship are still scrambling to figure out what things look like post that disastrous meeting between Donald Trump and President Zelenskyy on Friday.
Yes, indeed. And I think what's becoming incredibly starkly clear is that what Trump was talking about in his first presidency, that Europeans should do more, that we Europeans should do more for our own defense, should spend more on our own defense, that has been replaced by almost a a dislike of Europe and clearly in particular of Ukraine, and asking countries to do more for their own defense is very different from saying you're doing everything wrong, and of course with Ukraine alleging that Ukraine was somehow behind Russia's invasion. So it's not the question of burden sharing anymore. It's the US essentially switching sides, as I think one of your other guests said, and that is the incredibly complicated situation we're in now. Formally, we are allies of the United States, but the United States under this administration is communicating very clearly that they don't feel like our allies anymore.
Yeah, Elizabeth, we just saw the president of the European Commission arrive here. She was greeted by Sir Keir Starmer, and European leaders today are, in a frantic state trying to figure out what they can do next, because as the United States steps back, Europe will have to step up when it comes to diplomacy as well as the military support that they would potentially have to offer, including security guarantees to the Ukrainians. The big question is, can they do it without the United States?
It's clearly an extremely tall order, but what we're seeing today, even though it wasn't planned as an emergency summit, it has become an emergency summit. And what we're seeing today, I think, is incredibly encouraging. Not that long ago, we were talking about divisions within Europe, and we were talking about Giorgia Meloni, for example, as somehow being not helpful to the European cause because her ideology is different. Well, here we have a number of European leaders of different ideological persuasions, from the left to the right, and everything in between. And they are here they are in London to find a way to support Ukraine. That is incredibly important. It would not have been inconceivable for Europe, the European family, to disintegrate over this. But instead, these countries, these governments, these leaders are coming together to help Ukraine because they have concluded it's the right thing to do for moral reasons and also for reasons of keeping the rest of Europe safe.
Yeah, Elizabeth, grateful for all of your analysis there. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, with me now is Sir Adam Thompson, who served as UK ambassador to NATO from 2014 until 2016. Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. We're just speaking there to one of our guests who said European leaders could have disintegrated in the face of this, but frankly, they don't have a choice. They need to remain united, and they need to show support for Ukraine, not just because of Ukraine's interests, but because of their own interests.
Yes. Dead right. That is why NATO will not disintegrate, even if the United States leaves it. And this leaders' summit, which was already having to do some heavy lifting, is going to have to do quite a bit more in European interests today. What I think is happening is that the weight of diplomacy is shifting from the American foot to the European foot. The key thing in the Trump-Zelenskyy meltdown was President Trump's finding that Zelenskyy is not ready for peace if America is involved. So the challenge on top of everything else for European leaders today and for Keir Starmer is to demonstrate publicly that Zelenskyy is ready for peace if Europe is involved. And then to make that package attractive enough for Donald Trump to want to reinvest, at least as a mediator, even if he's not going to be on the Ukrainian or European side. So Keir Starmer has to today get tacit backing from fellow leaders for UK-French leadership, working with, as Keir Starmer said, one or two others, perhaps Meloni, perhaps Tusk, perhaps the incoming German Chancellor Merz, to produce a plan to stop the fighting, and then to form a coalition of the willing of Europeans around that plan and take it to Washington to see if the United States wants to buy into it or at least engage with it.
Is this, do you think, Ambassador, a moment of opportunity? We've often talked about the need for Europe to step up, whether it comes to defence spending and otherwise. We're just seeing, Ambassador, the Canadian Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, arrive here and meet with Sir Keir Starmer. Let's just show our viewers these images. The Canadians, of course, are here alongside European leaders, and Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau would know all too well about relations breaking down with the US President Donald Trump. Now, granted, not in the same way as it did with President Zelenskyy, but I would say that no love is lost between the two men either.
Yeah, correct. No, I think we've all learnt that the United States is no longer, regrettably, a reliable ally for Europe, but it remains, whether Europe likes it or not, a rather indispensable one. And that's the trick that Keir Starmer is trying to pull off today and in further British diplomacy. I have to say, in passing, it's terrifically good to see the British government doing agile, meaningful diplomacy. It is an opportunity, as you said earlier, Yalda, for Europe. As you correctly said, Europe does have to step up, whether it likes it or not, quite independent of the Ukraine crisis, because it is clear that the United States can no longer be relied on to the same extent for Europe's collective defense. So, in a sense, doing the things this leaders' summit was already going to do of strengthening Ukraine so that it can fight on in the absence of a peace deal, coming up with European security guarantees and appealing for an American backstop are all contributions to the continued safety and security of the United Kingdom and Europe anyway, irrespective of the Ukraine problem. So it is Ukraine driving something that has to be done anyway.
Yeah, and Ambassador, I mean, upping defence spending from 2.3 to 2.5 feels quite uninspiring. I mean, they're going to have to find clever ways to think about, bringing the technology and the kind of hardware that they invest in to the moment, to meet this particular moment. And as you alluded to earlier there, being agile about that and how they do that.
You're totally right. I'm clearly better defence and more defence spending is important, but it is actually for Europeans collectively, the greater challenge is not so much finding the money. I think they can do that if they have to. It is about spending it well. The United States is a single economy with a unified defense industry. Europe is 30 or so divided defense industries, and inevitably it's structurally inefficient. That really has to be tackled. It's a long-term challenge, and it's very difficult politically for leaders to agree to spend, pool their procurement and to spend in other people's countries rather than on their own defense industry. But in the end, we're going to have European defense consolidation to underpin European collective defense.
Yeah, Ambassador, I'm just going to read to you and our audience this statement on X that the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, has put out. He said that he feels very positive heading into today's meeting in London. The three key points, he said, was first to support Ukraine today. All in Europe will need to give more. I'm just going to interrupt us there because, of course, we can see Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor. He has just arrived talking there to Sir Keir Starmer. And as you say, Ambassador, a moment of opportunity for all of these leaders who have been forced to step up in this moment. But Mark Rutte also goes on to say, we all want a peace deal and it has to last. Europe is really stepping up here. And third, to keep NATO strong, Europe will increase defence spending. Ambassador, we've heard a lot of lip service to this. There now has to be tangible things that they do because time is not on their side.
Correct. And there are a lot of good ideas out there. And Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Union's Commission, is talking about relaxing the debt limits so that EU member states can spend more on defence. There's talk of a rearmament bank, some kind of financial mechanism that could put 100 billion into the pot for defence spending. They are already raising money for defence spending on the back of frozen Russian assets. And we saw yesterday with Zelenskyy, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister signing a £2.26 billion loan using that Russian money or the interest on it. So there are ways in which Europeans can find the money to step up their defence effort. They just need to also find the ways to procure efficiently, cost effectively, so that they reduce the number of defence platforms that they are buying, and therefore can buy in bulk and achieve economies of scale.
Ambassador, really grateful for all of your thoughts there. Thank you so much for joining us. And as we said, I mean, we've been watching and monitoring the situation here as European leaders arrive at Lancaster House for this all-important summit. And of course, our political editor, Beth Rigby, is here with me. And Beth, I mean, it's been quite a morning. We've started to see all of the European leaders arrive. They are feeling the weight of this meeting. It's like no other summit, frankly. We've seen two in Paris, but this is different given the bust-up on Friday.
Well, I mean, also the summit in Paris and some of the bilaterals. Keir Starmer had Chancellor Scholz of Germany over, and then he had President Macron over in Chequers for one-on-ones. That was all the groundwork building up to what they hoped was the formal bilaterals with Trump on Monday, with Macron, and then Thursday with Starmer. Zelenskyy was then going over. He was meant to sign the minerals deal, and then they were going to come here, European leaders, and they were going to work up what their contribution to this peace deal or peace negotiations that Trump was going to go into with Putin. And then Friday happened, the blow-up between Zelenskyy and Trump. Zelenskyy ejected from the White House, the minerals deal not signed, and everything up in the air. And this really now is an attempt to get things back onto track. But I also think that this is an admission, really, from the Europeans that they now need to do much more, that they cannot rely on Donald Trump to orchestrate these negotiations, that he is not necessarily the willing partner they might have wanted. And so what we're now seeing is our Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the French President Macron saying that they will now lead negotiations between European leaders and the President of Ukraine, Zelenskyy. They will put together a proposal and then they will take it to Donald Trump. So we're going to go back to the White House with a new plan. Is Zelenskyy going to go back and try and sign this minerals deal? And that is all the unknowns. All I can tell you is that when I talked to government sources, they went very dark in the immediate aftermath of the blow-up in the Oval Office, but now there's a bit more confidence that they feel that they can get this back on track, that they can broker a rapprochement between President Trump and Zelenskyy, and that they can come up with some sort of plan in which they can keep this show on the road. But it has been extremely tense. And all the while that this is happening and the Europeans are talking and President Trump is talking, what's in the mind of President Putin? Because he might be looking at what happened on Friday and the dislocation between European allies and the US and think, is it in my interest to go back to the table? Do I need to do that? Should I keep fighting? Will the US withdraw support from Ukraine? If they withdraw military support from Ukraine, can I take more territory? So it's not just diplomacy here. There's the hard realities of a conflict being fought. And we know that President Putin has increased his offensive and he's stepped up attacks on the ground as he tries to seize as much land from the Ukrainians as he can, because Trump had said in the past that he would freeze the lines of the conflict when the ceasefire was agreed. So I think that's a big unknown in all of this. As European leaders talk and as Trump talks, kind of what's now in the mind of President Putin, what are his calculations as he sees the unravelling, if you like, of the post-war alliance between Western allies and European partners and the US that has endured for 70 plus years.
Yeah, I mean, Beth, the way that I see it is that three possible things could happen here. The United States steps back its support. Europe then steps up its support and starts cranking up its defence expenditure. And potentially we could see the United States saying we can't work with this man and President Zelenskyy having to step down and resign. Regardless, as you say, those are still not tangible things to get Europe, the UK, in a position where they can defend themselves without security guarantees from the United States. They're going to have to be smart about where they get the money from.
Yeah, I think, look, the thing is there's a bigger question here about how has the arrival of a Trump in White House, in which he is signalling that he, on the one hand, wants to be isolationist, and then the other hand is a transactional power broker where he says, I'll do business with you, but I'm taking your minerals. You know, so on one hand, he's been isolationist, and then on the other hand, he's been quite interventionist. But the point is that the relationship is changing, and it's changing incredibly fast. And all of the rules which govern the international order, they've been ripped up and thrown in the air. So that, look, regardless of what happens in the short term on Ukraine and whether there can be a ceasefire, European countries now have a big issue that they all have to face for their own national security, about understanding that they cannot be reliant anymore on the superpower of the US to protect them. That's what Trump is signalling. So that is happening, I think, regardless of what happens in the shorter term. But right now, what they need to do is try and bind Trump in, because the other option which you were talking about is with the US withdraws. They'll have to try and scramble something together, but I think there's an admission from everyone that it is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, without US support in the short term. And look, Trump knows that. He showed that in the White House, in the Oval Office, on Friday. He said to Zelenskyy, you don't have the cards. I've emboldened you to act the tough guy because I'm backing you militarily. He knows that he has the power in this, and he's being transactional about it. So Europe, regardless, I think, are going to have to rethink how they handle and approach defence. But in the short term, really the only option I think that the Prime Minister would see is that he needs to try and get Trump back around the table and dealing in some way with Ukraine in order to just kind of climb them all back down the ladder and try and get some sort of peace deal, at least in principle, to then put to Putin. But, you know, he said, as I said in the press conference on Thursday, said it will either happen very quickly or not at all. And you know, before the Zelenskyy blow-up on Friday, it felt like they were finding a way to actually secure this ceasefire. And now it feels very much up in the air. Now, President Trump said, didn't he, or his aides said that he wants to try and do this within his first 100 days. And it might be that he is taking the calculation that he doesn't think he can bring President Putin to the table, and in which case he might just walk away and then say it wasn't down to me, it was down to President Zelenskyy and the Europeans.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I let you go, I mean, what we saw even at the beginning of that Zelensky-Trump meeting was, Donald Trump described him as a dictator 2 weeks earlier. The previous day, he said, you were at that press conference. He said, I don't think I said that. There were attempts, I think, to try and make something work with the Ukrainians. Now,
there were.
This blow-up, this really is a moment for Keir Starmer, though, isn't it? Because he's really come out of this like a grown-up. You said earlier, he's not a show pony. He's tried to, deal with Donald Trump and President Zelensky here yesterday.
Yeah, look, I think the first thing to say is, as you said, there was a material change in tone from President Trump once Zelensky agreed the minerals deal, which they were pressing him on. Once he had in principle agreed to that, Trump's tone towards him had changed. He's a deal maker, it's a transaction for him, and he got what he wanted. And his tone towards Zelensky changed. And that was a president that I saw up close on Thursday. We spent a good couple of hours listening to him talk about Ukraine, that genuinely seemed minded to sign that deal, get President Zelensky there, and then basically the Europeans were going to come back and make their offer on defence, and then off they went. And that did blow up. But in essence, Trump seemed to be getting into the place that European allies would want him to get to. He was non-committal throughout that meeting on Thursday, in both the formal press conference and then the more informal press conference that happened in the White House. He was not committing on security backstops. And as I said, that's because from a US perspective, they're just not going to do that without sort of ankle from not from the UK, from European partners about defence spending. But it was definitely a president that I looked and observed and thought, actually, you look like you are stepping up to the plate. OK, you're not as kind of friendly with your European partners as President Biden was, but you do want peace. What struck me actually about President Trump is every time he talks about it, he goes back to bloodshed and people dying. And when you talk about people around the Prime Minister, what they would say is that Trump really does seem to hate war. He hates the casualties. He hates the killing. And he does seem to want the war to end genuinely. It's just kind of how you construct a deal to do that. And it's been left to the Prime Minister to try and broker these negotiations. But then you could also say, how is it that all this carefully orchestrated diplomacy in the end falls onto the personality clashes or not of two individuals, a president at war and the president of a superpower? And that is extraordinary in itself that happens. And this is Prime Minister Maloney. Prime Minister Maloney, can you act as the bridge between the US and Europe?
Yeah, I mean, Prime Minister Maloney will potentially take one of the leading roles in this.
Yeah, and she actually said after the bilateral, or at the top of the bilateral meeting in Downing Street earlier today, she made a point of saying she thinks Italy can act as a bridge between Europe and the US because she has a very good relationship with President Trump. You know, Maloney, Macron, Starmer, they seem to have found a way with Trump. Other European leaders, particularly Chancellor Scholz, who was very upset about some of the things that some of the Trump team said, not least J.D. Vance, about free speech in Europe. Scholz has criticised publicly some of the remarks, and that goes down very, very badly in this White House. Now, whether people at home like it or not, because I know that people have very strong feelings about how President Zelensky was spoken to and that form of diplomacy or non-diplomacy, the way that the Starmer team have understood they have to manage Trump is that they have to not challenge him in public, not criticise him, focus on the actual things he does, not what he says. And that can be difficult. And President Zelenskyy obviously found that difficult in the end in the Oval Office, because that exchange and that sort of explosion came right at the end of quite a long
40
period.
minutes or so.
Yeah, and there's a reason why leaders tend to have formal press conferences, not informal sprays, as we call them.
I mean, we know that
because
these
they
sorts
can
of
go
heated
wrong.
conversations happen. And Beth, of course, you know, this was all part of a carefully choreographed week.
Really carefully.
President Zelenskyy was basically tutored by the experience of President Macron and the Prime Minister. So that's why this has been particularly difficult, I think, for European leaders, because they tried to manage that week so carefully, and it went badly.
The one thing I also would say that hasn't been discussed much about the Oval Office exchanges, though, is, and you must know, when I watched President Zelenskyy then do an interview on Fox News later that evening and was being very careful about what he said, he often referred to his translator to translate particular phrases of words he wouldn't necessarily have followed. And I think what has slightly gone unnoticed or underreported is that President Zelenskyy is dealing in English, and his English is really good now, but he's in the Oval Office. Vance is talking, the president is talking. He's not necessarily understanding some of the things that are going on. He might have used language he didn't mean to. He didn't refer back to his translator. And you can see that that is a recipe for things going really wrong in the moment, where he is in the Oval Office and trying to handle these exchanges in a way where he is also dealing in a language that is his third language.
Yeah, I mean, what has made President Zelenskyy a spectacular communicator over the course of the last 3 years, actually worked against him on Friday, because there have been moments, haven't there, Beth, over the course of the last 3 years where we've seen President Zelenskyy say to European leaders, say to the British Prime Ministers, I need this. I am fighting for freedom and democracy. I am defending your values. That just didn't seem to work with this White House.
It didn't work with this White House because, in a way, and I had sympathy for President Zelenskyy in that moment, because you know, he is leading a country at war. They have been invaded by an aggressor. They are trying to repel an aggressor. And he is carrying the burden of that and the burden of his people, who have lost thousands and thousands of family members and friends. And it's a painful thing. And I think in that moment when he felt that things were said to him that he needed to challenge, he did challenge them. And then it exploded in a way it did. And if you watch Macron and Starmer and the way they handled it, they did challenge, but did it in a very careful way, which comes, I guess, from being very fluent in that language as well.
Yeah, and Macron already had an existing relationship.
Yes, and I think that's difficult. And also, Trump's a power guy, right? Trump likes power. He understands power. He respects Starmer partly, and he'll say it himself, he won a big majority. Starmer's a winner. And when you looked at the language that Starmer adopted, he used Trump language to Trump. He talked about winning, and we want to be on the winning side. And so he had worked out a way to navigate Trump. But he actually, in the Oval Office, for the entire time he was in there, for about 40 minutes, I think Keir Starmer made 3 interventions. He barely spoke. It was almost like, just don't say anything in this forum. And it was just, look, I don't know what you think about whether it was coordinated. I know there's been some reporting about whether it was coordinated or not, this pile-on, if you like, against Zelenskyy. For me, having been in the White House and watched these sprays and how they happened, it seemed like just a moment where there's a bit of miscommunication, something said, President Zelenskyy felt he needed to correct the record, and then things deteriorated very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, the sense I got, as you say, about 40 minutes in, J.D. Vance started to bait him, and he frankly took the bait. And there are many who would have said, President Zelenskyy, you should have just stepped back, when they say the sky is purple, don't try and correct them. It's not about being right. It's about winning in this moment. And he had the burden of his nation and the you know
exactly.
the sort of trauma of his nation behind him. But actually, Ukrainians have come out in support of their president and said, look, he was treated very badly.
But did you notice as well when you saw him going into Downing Street yesterday, in the way in which Starmer made that very public gesture, walking down the street, and then the chairs set up rather like the Oval Office, and then talking about how people are on the street supporting him. Zelenskyy looked visibly moved, and I read that. I don't know about how you read that. I read that as a leader who's been under enormous pressure, has had a very, very difficult 24 hours, and felt some solidarity and kindness, and it moved him, because it must have been, you know, by all accounts, the Ukrainians, after this awful experience in the White House, Zelenskyy didn't want to kind of leave. He wanted to go back and try and do the deal. But going back to this idea of Trump is a transactional deal maker, he understands he does hold the cards when it comes to Zelenskyy. And if he felt disrespected, which he said he was, if he felt that in that moment, then it didn't seem a way that after I saw what happened, I thought there's no press conference today, that they're going to have to cool off. And I think it's going to be left now for President Zelenskyy to try to apologise and rebuild those bridges, whatever he personally feels the rights and wrongs of that. And that's real politics.
Yeah, and I think that is where I think the tricky moment is, because if he doesn't apologise, and he didn't apologise on that Fox News interview when he was asked whether he was going to say sorry, and he said this has been difficult for both us and the American president, and Americans choose their leader, it's up to the Ukrainians, when there were calls for his resignation. And I think ultimately this is going to be a very difficult moment for the leaders inside with this summit, for President Zelenskyy and what he's going to actually have to do next. He himself has said, you know, if I am asked to resign or step down for the sake of my nation, I will. But it was, and this is why I think that for the Prime Minister, he's really stepped up into this role, not being a show pony, called President Trump, called President Zelenskyy, greeted him here, showed him the support here in the United Kingdom for President Zelenskyy.
And then publicly been very careful about how he has reacted to what happened in the Oval Office. He didn't go on Twitter. He didn't say anything publicly.
He actually said that, didn't he?
He didn't, yeah, and he basically hit the phones. And then when asked about what he thought about those Oval Office exchanges, he said nobody wants to see that. And then when pushed, he said it was uncomfortable. And then he said the cameras were rolling, should have been behind closed doors, and that was it. So he did not publicly engage in any language against President Trump that President Trump would dislike. And he does that intentionally. And I know that some people within his party and people that voted for him would want him to lead in a way of calling it out and saying it's not acceptable. But for him, there is a bigger prize, which is, can he actually play his role in securing a lasting peace? And he understands that he needs to try and bring Trump on board for that. And that's his focus. Again, when you think about President Trump now, it's always about, and this is how I think about covering it now, it's all about not what he says, but what he does. Because he will say things, and then 2 weeks ago, later he didn't say it. I mean, even in the Oval Office, I said, well, you said that the EU had been constructed to screw the US on trade. And he looked at me and he said, did I say that? That's a bad word. Did I use that word? And I was like, yeah, you used it yesterday. So it's just, he'll say something in a way to perhaps take a position, and then actually when he's doing the deal, he rows back from it. President Zelenskyy, can you make it up with Donald Trump, sir?
Would you be willing to apologise to Donald Trump?
Will you apologise for the sake of peace, sir? President Zelenskyy, can you make it up with Donald Trump? Have you spoken to him, sir? Huh? President Zelenskyy, will you go back to the Oval Office and do the deal, sir? President Zelenskyy, will you go back to do the deal, sir? Can you patch it up with Donald Trump, sir? President Zelenskyy, have you spoken to Donald Trump? Have you spoken to President Trump, sir?
Patch things up with Donald Trump?
So, Beth, it's top of the hour, and just to our viewers, welcome back. You're watching Sky News, and we're here, Beth Rigby and I, at Lancaster House for our live and ongoing coverage of this emergency summit here at Lancaster House. And in the last minute or so, we've just seen the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy, arrive here at this at Lancaster House for this emergency summit. And Beth, it has become an emergency summit. I mean, it's been in the diary for the last week or so. And as you say, the French President Emmanuel Macron was there last Monday, marking the 3-year invasion of Ukraine. Then we saw Keir Starmer in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, that disastrous meeting then for Volodymyr Zelenskyy. He's come here to the embrace of European leaders. He's just walked into Lancaster House, where this summit will begin. This will be tough conversations. It won't be confrontational. All of these European leaders have offered their support to him, but they're going to have to make some tough decisions now.
This is about hard power now. Look, I think, you know, when you're saying like the optics of it for sure have changed, I think going into this before the Zelenskyy Oval Office blow-up, this felt more like an optics moment, if you like, whereby President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer went to the Oval Office, a deal signed between the US President and the Ukrainian President. European leaders come here and say, now we have this component between the US and Ukraine. We will now commit peacekeeping troops. We will pledge to you, Donald Trump, that we will put more money into NATO. We hear what you're saying, that we need to up our own commitments to European security. And then this would be the package, if you like, that formed the foundation of a President Trump able to then go to Putin and begin that negotiation. That was the choreography. And then it all came unstuck on Friday. What I would say is I think that there has been frantic diplomacy behind the scenes, with Macron getting involved. Actually, on Saturday, I think Macron had a conversation with the UK Prime Minister. Keir Starmer's spoken to President Trump twice, on Friday and on Saturday. And now the Europeans have, what has changed, the Europeans are saying now, look, we will sort out our end of this. We will come to you, President Trump, with a proposal. And then they've got to try and convince Trump that that is enough for him to then implement these security guarantees. Because if we go back to earlier in the week, what was this all about? It was about accepting that there was going to be some sort of ceasefire negotiations. Ukraine had lost their key asks, which was becoming a NATO member, not going to happen, and also getting the borders returned, not going to happen, not clear if it'll even happen to 2022 levels, you know, let alone 2014 levels when Putin annexed Crimea. And it was all about, would the US at least provide air cover or be a defender of the last resort in order to repel Putin to the borders of Europe and keep him there? And that was where they started. And now what you've got is a European set of leaders that really need to step up and offer those European security guarantees, if you like, in the hope that the US will then ride in behind them. And I think it is fair to say that at the moment, with what has happened, this fracturing of the Western alliance, that the person that will be pleased about this will be Putin, because for 3 years, the Allies were in absolute lockstep, the US and European partners, in supporting and backing Ukraine. And now that alliance is unravelling, and Putin might see that as an opportunity to continue fighting and try to take more land from Ukraine. So it's it's a high wire act. I suspect today that you will see the optics of a united front with European leaders, but also I think that there will be an effort to sort of show some material change as well in order to signal that they are serious about putting together some sort of peace arrangement. Look, if the US step out, the Europeans have no other option but to step in. There's no other option for them because it's not, as I said, just about the security of Ukraine. It's actually about the security of wider Europe, particularly those countries on that eastern flank.
Yeah, absolutely. A crucial meeting, a crucial moment. And as we say, geopolitics is all about relationships. Beth, thank you so much for all of your analysis there. That was our political editor, Beth Rigby, giving me some of her thoughts there on the back of what has been a tumultuous weekend. Joining me now is the senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Elizabeth Braw. Elizabeth, good to have you back on the programme. This is an all-crucial summit. All eyes are on it as European leaders come together to meet in what was not supposed to be an emergency summit, but certainly has become one.
Yes, it certainly has. And again, it's extraordinary to see all these leaders, despite having differences of ideology and indeed of practical politics on a number of issues, they are united on this issue of wanting to help Ukraine, of wanting to try to act as a bridge between Ukraine and the United States, and on a day like today, wanting to do more, not just in words, but they are here, where they are in London, to try to find practical steps they can take to quickly increase their support of Ukraine. If they didn't want to do that, their leaders would not be in London, but they are in London. And that is not to be taken for granted. And it also sends a strong message. Clearly, we will want an even stronger message to be sent to Putin. But this meeting does send a strong message. And we should remember that it includes people like, the meeting includes people like Giorgia Meloni, who before coming to power was often described by various commentators.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, Elizabeth, the question is, do they actually have a choice? I mean, they don't have a choice. This isn't just about Ukrainian security. This is about European security.
It is about European security. And as you say, there isn't much of a choice. If the US is serious about stepping back, then clearly every single European country has to do more. And we should remember that there are some star performers among European countries that do a lot for their own defense. If we look, for example, at Estonia, which spends a significant amount of money on its own defense, and then on top of that gives a significant amount of weaponry and other assistance to Ukraine. Then there are countries that are not such strong performers, and they include, for example, France and Italy, but they are all there today to try to figure out a way to do more. And I think what is the paradox here is that they have to figure this out, even though formally the United States remains a key participant in NATO and other security arrangements involving European security. So they essentially have to work on top of those arrangements, because it's not clear whether the US will honor those commitments. And those are commitments that in the case of NATO have been in place for many, many decades, and not just commitments, but integration of armed forces, of procedures, of policies, and to then have to sort of layer on top of that some sort of arrangements involving only European allies and Canada. It is really difficult, but at least they're making an attempt today, which will, of course, be followed by many more attempts, including at the level below prime ministers, so defense ministers, foreign ministers, and indeed the military level.
Yeah, as you say, I mean, it is a difficult moment, but it's perhaps a moment of opportunity.
Yes, it is. And talk about Europe, which, of course, is a collection of countries that are very different amongst themselves. But these conversations have been happening for years now, and calls for Europe, quote unquote, to do more. And now the moment of truth has arrived. And it begins with the leaders, the heads of government, making the commitment to making it happen, and then further details will obviously land on the desks of defense ministers and other ministers, and then with the armed forces. But at least the commitment is that, and it's worth noting that almost everyone has signed up politically to making this happen. The only question marks are Hungary and to a lesser extent Slovakia. They seem to be less committed to making this happen. But considering how many different countries there are in Europe, within NATO, within the European Union, and some are obviously many are members of both, it is to be saluted that the vast majority of them are committed to making this happen. And then on one last note,
yes, I mean, it's about the commitment, but it's also about finding tangible ways to up defense spending and being clever about it. Because we were talking earlier, I mean, going from 2.3% to 2.5% is not necessarily inspiring. They're going to have to skip a generation of weaponry here as well.
Yes, and how is that weaponry going to be manufactured? The defense manufacturers in our Western countries already have full order books. They can't just expand and speed up manufacturing because our governments decide from one day to the next, as will have to happen, that they are going to spend more. Defense manufacturing is a slow process. These are sophisticated pieces of kit that take a long time to make, and they require skilled workers. Where are those workers going to come from? I remember, for example, when Sweden had a prime minister who in his previous life had been a welder, and specifically a welder of submarines, and people thought that was funny, that, oh, he's only a welder. Well, I can tell you, we desperately need submarine welders, and we don't have them because we haven't needed them for a long time, or we haven't needed very many of them for a long time. Now we desperately need them, and they don't exist. They take a long time to train. This is a very sophisticated specialty, as are many other specialties that come that are involved in making this weaponry. So we can say, oh, we want to commit 2.5% or even 3% or even more of GDP to defense spending. But how is that weaponry going to be produced when defense manufacturers aren't able to expand quickly enough simply because they don't have enough qualified workers?
Yeah, absolutely. Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us back on the programme. And we, of course, will be speaking to you again at some point. Let's bring in our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who joins us from Kiev. And Deborah, just speaking there to our last guest about tangible steps that European leaders now need to take, because it's all good and well to talk about upping defence spending, but they need to be smart about the way that they do it and the way that it's manufactured and the kind of weaponry that they now focus on. They will essentially have to skip a generation of weaponry to get up to speed.
Yes, and Elizabeth is one of many people in our little defence community that's been sounding the alarm bells about the state of European lack of defences, the lack of thinking about the threat for a long time. And she's absolutely right. It's not just about the lack of capacity in the industrial base. It's also about the mindset of the companies. Why is a company like BAE Systems, the biggest British defence manufacturer, going to suddenly massively expand its production capacity for, say, for example, artillery shells without absolute guaranteed orders from the British government that it's going to have enough on its order books to last into the future? That may sound counterintuitive given the huge threat, but that has been a real restricting factor since Russia's full-scale invasion was launched more than 3 years ago now. Alarm bells rang back then in Western capitals across Europe, but unfortunately, because governments have lost that fundamental mindset that was a matter of second nature during the Cold War about the need to put defence and security and ensuring you have credible military capacity, depth, strategic reserves, an industrial base that can not just produce weapons at scale and speed, but also has the resilience and the supply chains to be able to keep on producing them in the moment of crisis. They forgot all of that, and so it requires prioritising defence above other nice-to-have peacetime priorities, such as, of course, the economy, health, social welfare, education, all of these things that successive governments for the past generation have focused on. Do you remember the saying, there's no votes in defence? There are votes in defence when there is a threat like there is right now in Europe, and that should have been plain to see ever since 2014, frankly, when Russia first tried to redraw the geography map when it invaded Crimea. But it's taken shockwave after shockwave, and here we are at this moment of absolute crisis where it's not just the threat from Russia that is alarming the UK and its allies. It's the threat of the United States moving away from Europe. And actually, it's got every right to do that in terms of being a member of the NATO alliance, but not being taken for granted by European militaries that have chosen not to maintain the kind of military capacity that America does. And America's capacity isn't endless. It too has had to, reduce spending, try to rationalise its defence industrial base, but it was doing it from a much bigger starting point. And I think that's what has been lost across Europe, in particular in the UK. Back during the two world wars, the Second World War, there was an enormous industrial base across the UK that was able to convert, for example, car factories into Spitfire factories. Imagine if we had to try to do that now. The entire industrial landscape has changed, has transformed, has lost that resilience. And so it's a moment of complete crisis and a moment of change that requires genuine, hard-headed leadership, which hopefully the Prime Minister is having these conversations now. But it's taken an awful long time, and it's been disappointing for those in defence circles to see that it's taken this long and to push the country and its allies to this point of danger and crisis for finally the blinkers to sort of be lifted and people to actually be staring at the problem. But the problem is huge, and as soon as you start thinking about it, you realise just how enormous a change is required if you really are going to get serious again.
Yeah, and that is the question, isn't it, Debs? I mean, we're 11 years since the annexation of Crimea. We are 8 years since Trump won, 3 years since the full-scale invasion, and yet it has been impossible to have these tangible conversations with European leaders about what they're going to do to up their defence spending. They pay the lip service, but they haven't actually put that into concrete action and prepared themselves for a moment like this.
And I think it's all to do with the fact that they haven't felt the threat. People in the UK haven't felt the existential threat that you absolutely feel when you're standing here in Ukraine, as you well know as well, when you're actually in a country where there are air raid sirens, missiles falling down, drone attacks, military forces engaged in World War II, World War I style trench warfare around this country, then of course here in Ukraine nothing else matters other than maintaining defence capabilities. But for Western Europe in particular, they haven't had to think about existential threat, at least since the end of the Cold War. World War II, it was a whole generations have passed since the end of World War II, and that idea of what a country's priorities should be has been allowed. I mean, it's very lucky, it's very fortunate that the peace dividend has enabled people to focus on more nice-to-haves than military hardware. But unfortunately, that has changed in the last 10 years. We've taken this holiday from history people talk about. And it is time, a lot of people say, it's overtime for the UK and its allies in particular to start making these hard decisions and reprioritising how they shape their economy, speak to their people. And if they really are going to want to harden their defences, given the threat landscape and given the fact that America has said very clearly now, this is the second Trump administration, it's the same message as the first time round, that Europe needs to take a much greater burden when it comes to protecting itself.
Debs, as always, thank you so much for all of your analysis. And we're going to actually stay in Kiev and speak to the Ukrainian MP, Inna Sovsun. Thank you so much, Minister, for joining us here on the programme. It is a difficult moment for your country, for your president. I just want you to react to what you're hearing and seeing.
Well, it is indeed very difficult, both on the emotional level, but then also trying to think strategically about how things can develop from here. And it's of course, with the stakes being so high for us over here in Ukraine, all decisions that are being made affect our lives very, very strongly. So of course, we have all been shocked with what we have seen in the Oval, 2 days ago. But we really hope that the world has also seen what has happened in the Oval, and that the world will actually stand behind Ukraine, as it did over the last 3 years of the full-scale invasion. And we hope that the summit taking place in London right now will not just be the moment when everyone recognizes the fragility in Europe, but will also recognize the strength that Europe has. Of course, Europe has relied on American, but we hope that they will also find strength in this moment.
Do you think President Zelenskyy took the wrong approach, or do you think that he was essentially so frustrated that it just all blew up there?
Well, it's probably easier to judge when we look at that from a bigger distance, both time-wise and geographical distance. We don't know how the conversation was going before. We don't know what was the reception over there, but we could definitely see that the emotions were high. And then, yes, one might say that probably President Zelenskyy could have reacted more calmly. But I also think that when one has to recognize the context that he comes from, he is the president of the country where people are being killed every single day. He is coming from the country, from the reality in which he has to face death and destruction. And I think that given that, it's important to understand that this is where he comes from. And when he has heard things that it's us who don't want peace, basically being blamed for all the atrocities, all the terror that we have been through. I think it's understandable why emotions ran high for him. We wish things turned out to be different, but I want also to recognize that we are all very traumatized by the events of the last couple of years, and president included.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's also part of this. It's not just about what happened on Friday night. The last 3 years has been incredibly difficult for the Ukrainian people. Would you say that Ukraine at this moment feels quite vulnerable despite, the show of support and solidarity that Europeans are now showing?
Well, of course we feel vulnerable. It's easy to speak in big geopolitical terms, but for us here, it's daily reality of death. The night it was night in Kiev, morning in DC when this has taken place. That day, I have learned that a good friend of mine has lost his second son on the front line. His first son died in 2022. His second son died on Friday early morning. And this is the context that we are living in. And this is something that we have to keep in our heads every day. We can't escape from that. So we want that terror to be over. When President Trump is saying that President Zelenskyy doesn't want peace, it can't be further from the truth, because reality is nobody wants peace more than Ukraine. We want peace more than anything, but we want peace in which will not break down in a week, a month, or a year, or 5 years from now, because living under this constant...
Yeah, because of course the Ukrainian people have experienced that before, where ceasefires have broken down in the past.
Yeah, indeed. After all, we had the ceasefire in 2016, and then and actually the war was slowly ongoing in 17, 18, 19, until it broke down into full-scale invasion in 2022. So I think everyone has to understand that if that threat will remain real, Ukraine will not be able to get back to business as usual. We will not be able to get people back to the country, to get investments back in the country, if everyone will be scared that it can start again. So that is what we try to prevent. We want to build a better future for us and our children, not just a short-term solution. Of course, we want the war to stop right away, but we don't want to end up in a situation where we are hearing explosions at 4:30 in the morning again and have nothing to defend ourselves with.
I just want to ask you about the mood around President Zelenskyy following Friday. Is there a feeling that perhaps he should step down? He's offered this before. He said, for the sake of peace, I would resign. There were senators in the United States and those within the Trump administration who said they couldn't work with him, that he should resign. Senator Lindsey Graham, for example. What's been the reaction to some of these statements?
Well, I think the reaction, both from supporters of President Zelenskyy, but also from people in opposition, including myself. I'm a member of parliament from the opposition, but I recognize that President Zelenskyy is a legitimate president of Ukraine, and it's only up for Ukrainian people to decide if he should continue to serve. As of right now, the idea is that he has to continue to serve. And then once it is possible, both legally and technically, then we will elect a new president. We will have elections, and then we will decide who will run the country after that. But at this point, no, nobody is talking about Zelenskyy stepping down, but there are conversations that probably we should have another negotiator on behalf of Ukraine, a mediator possibly, because we understand that there are harsh personal feelings after everything that has happened between President Trump and President Zelenskyy. So no, we're not calling for President Zelenskyy to step down, but we recognize that probably we should have some other mediator and someone else talking on behalf of Ukraine after everything that has happened in the Oval.
I just want to ask, before I let you go, has Ukraine sort of as a nation, and I know it's not a monolithic nation, but it is a nation at war, come to some kind of realization that it will have to make certain compromises and concessions, and that would mean the path to NATO, for example, and some of the things that we're hearing about, not being able to go to the borders of 2014, frankly, or even 2022?
Well, I think that if we look at the polling, more Ukrainians accept that we probably will not be able to get back all of our territory in the short-term perspective. Very few Ukrainians agree that we should just give up on that territory altogether, so legally accept that it's not our territory any longer, but probably more Ukrainians are more willing to accept that we will not control them in the near future. But the long-term security guarantees is something that Ukrainians are not willing to give up on.
Sorry, who's doing it? Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. We're so grateful for your time.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Elizabeth Braw. Elizabeth, thank you for staying with us here on the program. Of course, we've seen European leaders arrive here all afternoon, from the French President Emmanuel Macron to the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And we saw in the last half an hour or so President Zelenskyy arrive. It is a difficult moment for President Zelenskyy. I was just speaking there to a Ukrainian member of parliament who says that, they're not just traumatized from the events of Friday and what happened at the Oval Office, but they're traumatized as a result of what's happened to their country over the course of the last 3 years.
Yes, understandably so. And what she described is something that none of us would want to experience clearly. And I think this is the background against which we have to assess Ukrainian officials when they come and have meetings in our countries. They not only have to represent their country rather, but they do so against the background of incredible trauma. And on top of that, they converse in English, which is often their third language. So that's worth bearing in mind for those criticizing President Zelenskyy for maybe being, as they say, oversensitive in the meeting with Trump and Vance, and correcting Vance, J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, when he made incorrect statements regarding the war. They say, well, President Zelenskyy should just have let it go. Well, if you have been experiencing war, been subjected to war for 3 years, I think you can be forgiven for being a little bit sensitive when incorrect statements are being made about your country at war and about the aggressor. And by the way, credit from a linguistic point of view, credit to President Zelenskyy for having not only mastered English over the course of these 3 years, but being willing to travel around the world, make the case for his country in meetings with officials, and indeed in media interviews in English. That is an incredible feat by somebody who is not only new to politics, but also relatively new to the English language.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I'm just going to keep you there and just read out to you and our viewers the statement that we're hearing from Sir Keir Starmer. He said European leaders need to step up at a once-in-a-generation moment. He said this at the start of this defence summit, which, as we were saying, has now turned into an emergency summit here in London. We've also heard from the National Security Advisor of the United States, Mike Waltz, who's speaking in an interview with CNN in the last few minutes, said that it is absolutely false that the Oval Office meeting with President Zelenskyy was some kind of ambush. He also said that President Zelenskyy needs to make clear that he is ready for peace. So some statements coming there from the Trump administration officials. We also heard from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, shortly after that blow-up on Friday between President Zelenskyy and President Trump, where he said that they needed to see that President Zelenskyy was ready for peace. It was also a statement that Donald Trump put out shortly after what happened during that disastrous meeting at the Oval Office, where he said President Zelenskyy can come back when he is ready for peace. Elizabeth, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation, because there is this feeling from Trump administration officials, rightly or wrongly, that President Zelenskyy here is not ready for peace. And you heard it there from President Trump when he said, I've emboldened you to be a tough guy. You couldn't do that without us. And we want this deal. If it doesn't happen, you know, when we're out. So this was quite a confrontation that we saw on Friday. But the Trump administration officials have made it clear, and even Mike Waltz here in this interview with the National Security Advisor with CNN, saying that President Zelenskyy needs to make it clear that he is a man that's ready for peace now.
I think it comes down to what constitutes peace. So if Trump and his team seem to view peace as the absence of military violence, but peace, a lasting peace from Ukraine's perspective, and I think from most other countries' perspective, is an arrangement under which the attacked country can once again live in security without having to worry that the invader will again invade. And these are two quite different things. To have lasting peace, you have to have quite significant arrangements. Either the invader has to essentially admit to having acted in an incorrect fashion, to use an understatement, and has to somehow repent and promise never to invade again, and be contrite, or you have to have some sort of arrangement that prevents that neighbor from attacking ever again. And that is what Ukraine is asking for, on the basis that Russia cannot be trusted not to invade again. I think if one is to look at Russia's track record when it comes to attacking, harming, invading its neighbors, Ukraine is right to worry that Russia cannot be trusted to uphold any sort of promise that it might make to invade Ukraine again. And again, these are two quite different things. The first is essentially a promise by Russia. The second is an arrangement that allows Ukraine to trust that promise by Russia. And that arrangement is a security guarantee by Western allies of Ukraine.
Okay, I'm just going to interrupt you there, Elizabeth, because we can hear some of the meeting inside. Let's just go to that live now.
And they wanted to come, so there's incredible clearance in relation to Ukraine. And so I think the hope, you know, that we're all with you, people of Ukraine, for as long as it takes, and everyone around us table. So it's very, very good to have you here. We're gathered here today because this is a once-in-a-generation moment for the security of Europe, and we all need to step up. Getting a good outcome for Ukraine is not just a matter of right and wrong. It's vital for the security of every nation here, and many others too. I spoke to our Baltic allies this morning. Together, they obviously are part of our discussion. And all of Ukraine's partners have to lead this moment and grab it with both hands. And in my conversations over recent days, we've agreed that a group of us will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting and then discuss that with the US and take it forward together. That's really important. And that was the focus of my...
we were just...
Really loud in my ear with this. Okay, you were having a sense of some of that meeting taking place on the inside, and apologies for the audio. It wasn't necessarily the best quality, but we heard a little earlier from the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, at the start of that this defence summit that we're all here now, and he said European leaders need to step up at a once-in-a-generation moment. And of course, as I said, we've also been hearing today from some Trump officials, the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who spoke to CNN and said that President Zelenskyy needs to make clear that he is ready for peace. This is something that Donald Trump has stated. He put out a statement straight after that blow-up at the Oval Office on Friday saying President Zelenskyy is not ready for peace. He can come back when he is. So this is a tense moment for the Ukrainian president, who is just in that building behind me here at Lancaster House, where they're having this all-important now emergency summit. So we'll be bringing you all of those lines coming out of the summit in the next few moments. But you are watching Sky News. Stay with us. Lots more coming up.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We start with breaking news. Historic day here today.
The golden age of America begins right now.
A long-awaited ceasefire is now underway.
First question, Sky News.
This is a huge moment.
It's incredible.
Now to California.
Do you owe citizens an apology? Have you nothing to say?
Jane Secker, Sky News. Would you like to respond to us now?
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
In principle, would you agree to do that?
Criticism of you is banned. How is this a fair election?
The cameras are poised, waiting to see what the president might do next.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky Security and Defence Editor. I've covered Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin. Sky News, get the full story first.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent.
Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome back to our live and continuous coverage of this emergency summit, Defence and Security Summit, now taking place here in London. And you're looking at some pictures that came in the last few minutes. And as you can see, European leaders, the Canadian Prime Minister, all embracing President Zelenskyy inside Lancaster House in the lower hall where this summit is taking place. They have showed their solidarity to the Ukrainian leader after that disastrous meeting at the Oval Office with President Donald Trump on Friday. President Zelenskyy traveled virtually immediately after that fell apart on Friday to London, where he was welcomed with open arms, literally, by Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer here in London, in Downing Street, and to the cheers of many supporters who had gathered on the streets outside 10 Downing Street. And then, of course, this summit, which was in the diary for some time, part of a carefully choreographed week of diplomacy. We saw the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, arrive at the White House last Monday. It was also 3 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And then just a few days later, Sir Keir Starmer was at the Oval Office, and he was described as Charmer Starmer at the time because the meeting, the optics of it went so well. And then, of course, that blow-up that we saw at the Oval Office between the Ukrainian president and President Donald Trump. Now, we're hearing from some of the U.S. administration officials, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. We've also heard in the last half an hour or so from the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz. Mike Waltz has said that President Zelenskyy needs to show that he wants peace. And Marco Rubio has said that he has not spoken to President Zelenskyy since things fell apart and disintegrated on Friday. But you were looking at some of those images of European leaders gathering around President Zelenskyy, embracing him, which they often do when they've gone in the middle of this conflict to visit him in Kiev, when they've welcomed him over the course of the last 3 years to European capitals. He has arrived and they have welcomed him. But it is crucial in this moment for a president that was confronted in the Oval Office. And there were calls for his resignation at the time from senators who were outraged that he had confronted Donald Trump, that this meeting had turned out the way that it had. I spoke to Ukrainians who say they were traumatized, not just from 3 years of war, but what unfolded in the Oval Office. And so President Zelenskyy arriving here at this summit in the last hour or so, and then inside we could see the leaders there embracing him and showing their of support and solidarity for this beleaguered leader who was welcomed into European capitals as a hero for the last 3 years, but that's not how it unfolded for him on Friday at the Oval Office. Well, let's bring in the former Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff, Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mail, who joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. And it's been a difficult weekend for President Zelenskyy. It's been a difficult weekend for transatlantic relations. But what we just saw there now was President Zelenskyy being embraced by European leaders who are sending a clear message, but it is a tightrope for them. It is a dilemma because on the one hand, they do want to show solidarity for the Ukrainian president in this conflict and to send a very clear message to Vladimir Putin, but they also know that Donald Trump is watching things unfold here as well.
Yeah, very true. Winston Churchill said, don't let a good crisis go to waste. The Chinese have a diagram for crisis, which is danger and opportunity. This has focused people's minds. I don't think any of us would have wanted to have seen the scenes we saw in the Oval Office. But it is worth remembering just how critical America is in this equation. All those people standing with Zelenskyy and hugging him, quite rightly, we're very close to what's going on in Ukraine in a way the Americans are not. And yet America brings more to the party in terms of sort of wealth and military capability than all of those leaders put together. And it is really important that we do not allow this, I say, crisis, danger, the danger in the crisis rather than the opportunity, to drive the Western alliance apart. And so we need to find out what we mean by peace. And very understandably, Zelenskyy and Ukraine don't want a sellout. But we need to work out what would be a sustainable, durable peace that would lead to both Ukraine, obviously, but very much Russia's neighbors and all the European members of the Atlantic Alliance feeling confident that we haven't just got an armistice or a ceasefire, we've got a genuine peace.
And that is going to be the challenge here and for European leaders, because on the one hand, it's all good and well to embrace President Zelenskyy, but they have to think about how they're going to up their defense spending and meet this moment. And as you say, not to waste this moment. We've seen already Sir Keir Starmer really appear like the grown-up in the room here. He's not, posturing. He's not being a show pony in any way. He's contacting Donald Trump. He's also trying to manage President Zelenskyy, who immediately arrived here in London. And that is a difficult moment, but it does seem like European leaders are trying and wanting to step up, but they also need to step up when it comes to their defense spending.
Yeah, yes, absolutely they do. This is why I say there is an opportunity here. But interestingly, if you look at the Americans have an economy that's big enough to have guns and butter. The Russians have quite clearly put their economy totally on a guns basis. And it's very arguable that the Europeans have gone for butter for far too long. Russia is weak. We hope it will be weaker at the end of this war, but it may well be revanchist. And we've got to use the time both to rearm or arm, one could argue. And I think we've also got to change the whole model. We've got to become a more resilient society. We are undoubtedly flabby as a result of basically decades of freeloading. And I think we've got to drive for growth. That's Starmer's great cry. We hear a lot about it, but then we see social and economic policies that quite clearly don't allow growth. And without growth, we are going to be forced into having to make some really shocking priority decisions between defense, social spending, health, education, policing, you name it. But this is a time really to look at whether the model has served us well or is going to serve us well in the future. And that's why I say there is an opportunity here to be straight and level with the population of Europe, but in a manner that both secures peace and continues to lock our great friends, the Americans, in. And although there may be visceral individual dislike or whichever of Donald Trump or his agenda, it is really important that America stays engaged in our security, our collective security, and as a bastion of what so many things we hold dear as what we collectively call the West.
Indeed, because would you agree that this isn't just about Ukraine and it's not about Ukrainian territory or its path to NATO or this attempt by Russia to continue to salami slice into Ukrainian territory? This is about a revisionist, imperial power that is now looking further westward beyond Ukraine, and that is what's terrifying NATO countries like Poland, for example, like Estonia, because they're thinking this isn't just about those things like NATO membership for Ukraine. We are worried about this existential threat beyond that.
This is absolutely global. I used to say to my colleagues when I was in Baghdad, if you want to understand this problem, you have got to get yourself a bigger map. And this is where Greenland, China, Iran, Gaza, Beijing, Moscow, Warsaw, everything is tied, everything is linked to everything at the moment, globally, ideologically, militarily, economically. And you've got to keep spinning the globe around to look at it from other people's points of view and perspectives. And one has to be empathetic with the Americans. They do look at a continent that's very, very rich, that has a threat, and they do feel, hey, either you need a wake-up call or we genuinely are going to step away. And we've got to stop that line of thinking. So that's why I say, I think from every level, we should be doing more. It's a great pity. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, when we saw the Berlin Wall came down, we didn't feel we'd be confronted. But we really took a holiday from history. And if you're in Finland or Sweden or Poland or the Baltic states, this is really looking very existential. Even from Britain, it's still a little bit academic. But soldiers from my regiment are in the Balkans, soldiers from my regiment are going to be in Poland, soldiers from the British Army are in Estonia. So this is a really time for grown-up leaders to look at each other in the face around that table where Starmer is now hosting and Zelenskyy sitting there, and join up the immediacy of the problem in Ukraine, the existential potential threat from Russia for other NATO allies, and then the wider issue of how does the West, inverted commas, confront these challenges. And a lot of it does go back to having to grow an economy that's big enough to afford a sustainable, credible defense while continuing to defend all the values that we hold dear in this in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. We're so grateful for your time. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's just show you some of the images that have come in the last 20 minutes or so from inside the summit. Let's have a listen in to what Sir Keir Starmer has been saying at the opening of this Defence and Security Summit here at Lancaster House.
Right, should we make a start? Can I just say welcome, everyone. It's really fantastic to see you here, and thank you very much for being here. Obviously, I want to say a particular welcome to President Zelenskyy, Vladimir. You heard, I think, last night when you arrived at Downing Street, the crowds outside cheering. That was totally spontaneous. They had learned that you'd arrived, they knew you were visiting, and they wanted to come and show the strength of feeling in relation to Ukraine. And so I think and hope you know that we're all with you, people of Ukraine, for as long as it takes, and everyone around this table. So it's very, very good to have you here. We're gathered here today because this is a once-in-a-generation moment for the security of Europe, and we all need to step up. Getting a good outcome for Ukraine is not just a matter of right and wrong. It's vital for the security of every nation here, and many others too. I spoke to our Baltic allies this morning. Together, they obviously are part of our discussion. And all of Ukraine's partners have to meet this moment and grab it with both hands. And in my conversations over recent days, we've agreed that a group of us will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting and then discuss that with the US and take it forward together. And that's really important. And that was the focus of my discussions with Vladimir yesterday and then with President Trump and President Macron. And it's an important step forward after Friday. Today's meeting is a moment to unite around this effort, to discuss how we can deliver a just and enduring peace together, and to make sure Ukraine can defend and deter against any future Russian attack. And we're going to discuss how we can deliver more support to Ukraine now, because even while Russia talks about peace, they're continuing their relentless aggression. So that's the agenda, and we need to agree what steps come out of this meeting to deliver peace through strength for the benefit of all of us. So let's get started. We'll pause just for a moment whilst the cameras leave, and then we can start the meeting properly.
We would start to argue.
We're back with Yelda and team in a short while. The Prime Minister there inside Lancaster House convening that meeting of European leaders plus Canada, looking for a way forward to try and bring peace to Ukraine. Our military analyst Sean Bell is here with us. And Sean, a lot of the talk in and around that table will be about military spending and how they can make sure that those nations there are spending enough to try and ward off Russian aggression.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Kamali, isn't it? The main agenda for this Starmer is it's a sort of three-part agenda, I think, largely focused, obviously, around Ukraine at the moment. If Ukraine is going to be positioned for some form of negotiated end, they want to have a relatively strong Ukraine, want to have the EU support for some sort of security guarantee and also get US backdrop. The trouble is that the wider backdrop to this, of course, is that if the US decides to walk backwards away from NATO and away from Ukraine, the question is how does everybody fill that gap? And after those fateful scenes in the White House on Friday, was that scene between Trump and Zelenskyy just a one-off, or did that portend to a bit of an ambush? And actually that's what's caused the real carnage for leaders today.
It has indeed. And Sean, we've got this chart here that shows how much NATO member states are spending. I think 23 out of the 30 is spending that 2% of GDP.
Part of this is this an issue with President Trump more about NATO spending, or is it about actually Ukraine support? Look at NATO spending first. When Trump first came to office the first time round, 2/3 of NATO wasn't paying their way. Now, 1/3 is not paying their way. Interesting to know, Italy falls below that 2%. This wasn't meant to be an ambition. This was meant to actually be a baseline to it. But Italy's got a good relationship with America. Therefore, they want to see. If America was to walk away from this, it would have huge implications because volume of spend, NATO, even all the nations of NATO spend less than the US alone. But I think if we turn to Ukraine, what's really interesting is the US has always used this GDP metric as a way of your level of commitment. And if we look, we've got a graphic that shows the level of commitment by GDP of nations to Ukraine. And that tells a very different story. It no longer is the lead the US. If you look here, so this is, again, NATO countries' commitment to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP. Here's the United States and here's the United Kingdom. You look at the number of nations now closer to you that are spending more, and most specifically, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states are spending significantly more as a percentage of GDP. So there is mixed messaging here that definitely as a proportion of GDP, the world is stepping up, and particularly Europe. The question is, can they fill the capability gaps, the military gaps that America currently provides? That would be incredibly difficult.
I suppose it puts light to the idea that Europe is a complete laggard in terms of supporting
Absolutely.
Ukraine. On the military side of it then, Sean, we've heard today from Keir Starmer saying that alongside the French, there is talk of coming up with some kind of peace deal that may well be put to the Americans to try and bring the war to an end. We've also heard about boots being on the ground. I mean, when you think about it militarily, what could be done by the French and the UK, what does it look like in terms of trying to bring some kind of a peace settlement?
Well, bluntly, we've got very little time. If you're going to be very difficult, you ideally want a diplomatic solution. You need to sort that out with Trump and smooth the waters. But if you don't, one of the other options is actually you start putting boots on the ground, a no-fly zone in, because Europe could outmuscle Russia significantly, stop them in their tracks in Ukraine. So far, we haven't had the appetite to do that. I understand why boots on the ground might be a step too far, but a no-fly zone would have profoundly positive implications. It's a question of whether Europe's got the muscle and the willpower to do it. That will undoubtedly be one of the issues they're discussing over the tables today.
Certainly will be. We'll perhaps find out a little bit what they have discussed. Sean, for now, thank you very much for that. Of course, we'll be back with the Yelda team at Lancaster House very soon, where leaders from around Europe as well as Canada have arrived for discussions on trying to bring peace to Ukraine.
This is Sky News today. It's 3 o'clock. I'm Yalda Hakim, live from central London, where Europe's leaders are meeting to discuss a plan for peace.
Have you spoken to President Trump, sir?
Things up with Donald Trump?
A once-in-a-generation moment, critical day for the continent and its security as the Prime Minister greets President Zelenskyy for the Ukraine summit. Leaders gather in London to discuss a way forward on a ceasefire plan to present to the United States.
We've now agreed that the United Kingdom, along with France and possibly one or two others, will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting, and then we'll discuss that plan with the United States.
Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock. I'm Yalda Hakim and I'm live here from central London, where the Prime Minister has urged leaders to step up at a once-in-a-generation moment for security in Europe at the start of the Defence Summit on Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer has welcomed a host of international leaders to the summit, focusing on Ukraine in light of America's apparent withdrawal from European affairs. Sir Keir Starmer is urging those gathered today to boost defence spending as he tries to shore up support for Kiev. And all afternoon we've been seeing these 18 visiting leaders arrive here at Lancaster House and pose for what's known as a family photo with Sir Keir Starmer, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy and France's Emmanuel Macron front and centre. The Prime Minister opened the discussions by welcoming all the visiting leaders and also addressed the absence of the Baltic states at this summit. Let's just have a little listen in.
Can I just say welcome everyone. It's really fantastic to see you here and thank you very much for being here. Obviously I want to say a particular welcome to President Zelenskyy, Volodymyr. You heard, I think, last night when you arrived at Downing Street, the crowds outside cheering. That was totally spontaneous. They had learned that you'd arrived, they knew you were visiting, and they wanted to come and show the strength of feeling in relation to Ukraine. And so I think and hope you know that we're all with you, people of Ukraine, for as long as it takes, and everyone around this table. So it's very, very good to have you here. We're gathered here today because this is a once-in-a-generation moment for the security of Europe, and we all need to step up. Getting a good outcome for Ukraine is not just a matter of right and wrong. It's vital for the security of every nation here, and many others too. I spoke to our Baltic allies this morning. Together, they obviously are part of our discussion. And all of Ukraine's partners have to meet this moment and grab it with both hands. And in my conversations over recent days, we've agreed that a group of us will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting and then discuss that with the US and take it forward together. And that's really important. And that was the focus of my discussions with Volodymyr yesterday and then with President Trump and President Macron. And it's an important step forward after Friday. Today's meeting is a moment to unite around this effort, to discuss how we can deliver a just and enduring peace together, and to make sure Ukraine can defend and deter against any future Russian attack. And we're going to discuss how we can deliver more support to Ukraine now, because even while Russia talks about peace, they're continuing their relentless aggression. So that's the agenda, and we need to agree what steps come out of this meeting to deliver peace through strength for the benefit of all of us.
That phrase that we often hear from the Prime Minister, mirroring what Donald Trump often says, peace through strength at this critical time for Europe, for Keir Starmer, who has really taken the role of bridging the gap between the Ukrainian president and Donald Trump after that disastrous confrontation at the Oval Office on Friday. But joining me now is the senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, Elizabeth Braw. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us here again on Sky News and on the programme. It's been quite an extraordinary weekend. I heard things like they were shocked and it was a remarkable confrontation that we saw. Often in geopolitics, these sorts of things happen behind closed doors. We often hear that when things are leaked that there was some kind of, a brawl that takes place, but it never happens in this way, never in front of the cameras, never in this kind of very crucial moment where Ukraine is so dependent on military support, security guarantees from the United States. And now he's arrived here in Europe yesterday to the embrace of Keir Starmer, and today in this summit at the lower hall of Lancaster House, just behind me, where European leaders embraced him, showed their solidarity and their support, which we saw after Friday's confrontation as well. But for European leaders, for Keir Starmer, for Emmanuel Macron, even for the Italian Prime Minister, this is a tightrope of managing what happens here today, managing their security and defense, showing their support for President Zelenskyy, and also trying to manage the relationship with Donald Trump.
Indeed, and you mentioned Prime Minister Meloni of Italy. She is a case in point. She is, as you said earlier, somebody who has a relatively good relationship with Trump. She was invited to the inauguration, which was really quite a strong signal from the Trump team, since other European leaders were not. She was. Most likely because she's seen as representing the right wing of European politics, and indeed has on that basis built good relations with Trump over the years. But what's interesting about her is that she is also a very strong supporter of Ukraine. She has managed to convince her coalition in Italy to support Ukraine. She has regularly dressed down with those within her coalition and in the opposition who have advocated for a softer approach to Russia and a less forceful support of Ukraine. And here she is, essentially Donald Trump's perhaps most aligned leader, the European leader most aligned with Donald Trump, yet she takes a completely different position on Ukraine compared to Donald Trump. And how is she going to square that circle? And it also illustrates, I think, the unpredictability of Trump. So he has chosen to take this confrontational approach to Ukraine and to Volodymyr Zelenskyy in particular, but it's not based on any particular ideology, and that makes it so hard for European leaders to try to predict what position Trump would take, not just on Ukraine but on other national security issues that may come up, and there will be many of those.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for Donald Trump, he points the finger of blame of the way that things have unfolded on his predecessor, Joe Biden. He even raised that at the Oval Office in that shouting match with President Zelenskyy. And in many ways, he sees President Zelenskyy, this conflict, as the Biden administration's war and conflict, and the way that they rallied NATO allies, European allies around this conflict. And so I guess the European leaders want to almost show that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's an existential threat for their defense and their security. And that's why we're seeing the likes of Giorgia Meloni, despite her close relations with the Trump administration, with the likes of Elon Musk, for example. She's now taking a very different approach to this particular situation. And European leaders are showing that they want to show their support and solidarity and rally behind President Zelenskyy.
Indeed, and yet you're even seeing a country like Canada now. Admittedly, Canada isn't doing an enormous amount in practical terms for Ukraine, but is there to support Ukraine at this summit, even though Canada is clearly not very much affected by the Ukraine war at all, and could take a similar position to the United States by essentially saying, as J.D. Vance has said, I don't care how this war ends one way or another, but Justin Trudeau, like his European colleagues, is making the case that this is not just about Ukraine and it's not just about European security. It's about right and wrong in this world, and it's about supporting countries that have unjustly been attacked by other countries. And it's interesting to think about the extension of Trump's reasoning on supporting Ukraine. So he doesn't think there is anything in it for America, and he also doesn't think there is anything in America in supporting South Korea, Taiwan, and indeed Europe. He wants it to be more of a transactional relationship where America provides support if these countries pay the equivalent amount in cash for it. And yes, you can argue that would benefit the American Treasury. But what America gets out of playing this significant role in the security of other countries is that these countries, including the UK, will defer to America on matters of national security. America is the undisputed leader of the West because it plays that preeminent role in keeping not just Europe safe, but keeping South Korea safe, Taiwan, other countries, Japan. And if America were to step back and say, well, we're only doing it if you pay the equivalent amount in cash, then these countries will obviously say, well, we will try to do more ourselves, as you, America, have said we should. And then America's preeminent role in the world vanishes very quickly. And it's not clear that Trump or Vance or anybody in this current administration has thought about that implication for America standing in the world.
Yeah, Elizabeth, really fascinating hearing all of your thoughts there. Thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. Well, I'm joined now by the chairman of Denmark's Defence Committee, Rasmus Jarlov. Mr. Jarlov, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. I've spoken to many people this afternoon who have actually said in this moment of what appears to be crisis at this emergency summit, this is also a moment of opportunity, certainly for Europeans to step up and take a more leading role as they wait to see where the United States is going to position itself.
It's hard to see anything positive about what's going on at the moment, but Europe has to step up. Europe has to take the responsibility and take charge of what's going on the European continent. There's no question about that. This is so crucial for all of Europe that we don't have a Russia that is given a victory and that is encouraged to attack again some other time. So we cannot allow the United States to hand over Ukraine to Russia, which seems to be what they want to do. And that would be very, very dangerous for Europe. So Europe must start paying the bills and Europe must be in charge.
Do you genuinely believe that the United States just wants to hand Ukraine over to Russia? Or is it that Donald Trump essentially wants Volodymyr Zelenskyy to be more deferential? I mean, we saw it there with J.D. Vance saying you need to be more thankful, and they want him to sort of apologize and toe the line. But also what we keep hearing from the administration is that their feeling is that President Zelenskyy doesn't want peace. Is there a way of President Zelenskyy turning this around? Because he's been this extraordinary communicator, and what's made him so spectacular over the course of the last 3 years backfired and blew up because he did try in some way to respond or react to the way that he was being baited at the Oval Office.
I'm pretty sure that President Zelenskyy would be willing to run naked through New York City if that was required of him to get security guarantees and save his country. It cannot be about emotions and personal egos and about who is humble enough and who said thank you enough. It must be about what is right and just and what is in the interest of the Western world. And I don't think the Americans want to hand over Ukraine to Russia as per se, but I do think that that's what they're about to do, because they don't want to contribute anymore. They don't want to pay anymore, and they have unfortunately been misled by a false narrative that Zelenskyy is a bad guy who's just trying to exploit the United States, and that Europe are bad guys that want to exploit the United States. And they want to show that they're fed up with that and they want to end the war. But of course, no one can decide what is better for Ukraine than the Ukrainians themselves. And they have elected a president through a free and fair democratic election. And his judgment and the judgment of all of the Ukrainian politicians who back him up is that A peace now will only be a ceasefire and an opportunity to Russia to build up their forces to attack them again later on. And that's just unacceptable to both Ukraine and the rest of Europe. So we have to avoid that scenario.
I mean, yes. Obviously, Denmark has had their own confrontations with President Trump, and you are concerned about where you might be positioned in all of this.
Well, we have a separate issue with the United States about Greenland that has been discussed a lot in the public, but that has nothing to do with this Ukraine issue that we're dealing with right now. We're only looking at what's going to happen in Europe if Russia gets a victory. And what will happen is that a peace agreement with Russia isn't even worth the value of the paper that it's written on. They break their promises, they break their treaties, they break agreements. Whenever they feel that they have an advantage of doing it, they will attack again. And it seems that Russia already thinks that they're at war with the West. They think they're at war with us already. And if you think that way, then you're going to attack again. And they will attack the Baltic countries probably as the first target. And we just cannot have a situation where it's not made crystal clear to the Russians that if they do not stop their war, they will be stopped by force. And of course, it's a big problem that the Americans don't want to send that message to Russia, because Europe is strong, but the Americans are stronger. And if they don't back us up, then that is an invitation for Russia to attack again. So I think Europe has to take charge. And now we have to build up our defense forces and our military industry as fast as possible. And we also have to tell the Americans that
Do you think that is now possible? Because for years we've been hearing from European leaders talk about having to up their defence spending, crank things up. Do you think that is currently European countries, the EU, NATO, are in a position to do that?
I mean, we can do it, but it is a matter of political will. And when you see countries like France, who has a president who does a lot of talking and always talks about the necessity of Europe to step up, but doesn't contribute very much. France has paid 0.2% of their GDP in 1 year. You have Germany, who is paying more, but is holding back important weapons. And very, very few countries are really taking this seriously. You have Norway, who is extremely rich, but has paid less than Denmark, who's not as rich as they are. So a lot of countries are not doing their part. We can do it. We can easily do it. And it would be much cheaper for Europe to stop Russia now than having to spend 4 or 5% of GDP on defense in the future. If we spend 1 or 2% helping Ukraine now, Ukrainians will win. There is no comparison between the economies of Europe and Russia. It's like 15 times bigger. So if Europe stands up and helps Ukraine, there will only be one outcome, and that will be a Ukrainian victory. But if we're hesitant, like we have been so far, then the Americans are going to stop helping because they think it's too expensive. And then Ukraine will lose, and that will be a very, very bad outcome for Europe. So it's really a time of choosing now. European leaders have to stop talking, have to stop tweeting, and they have to start paying, and they have to send the arms to Ukraine right now.
We're really grateful, Mr. Rasmus Jarlov, Chairman of Denmark's Defence Committee, for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring in our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who joins me now. And Sam, I've been speaking to European leaders all afternoon about how they viewed events which unfolded on Friday night, how they expect things to unfold here today. But it really has been a moment for Keir Starmer, who has appeared like the grown-up in the room, straddling this relationship with Donald Trump and then embracing Volodymyr Zelenskyy when he arrived here yesterday. He hasn't been the show pony. He's just tried to play it straight and try to straddle this difficult balancing act now.
That's right. I mean, Keir Starmer looks like he has seized the moment and put Britain at the centre of a vital global conversation with first Volodymyr Zelenskyy yesterday, and then lots of world leaders, not just European ones, turning up here at Lancaster House. And I think the Prime Minister's main calculation, his main job today, is to sort of take down the temperature. He started doing this yesterday, and in interviews this morning, you heard him continue with that. Because undoubtedly the personality politics on Friday night, as we all saw across that 40 minutes, went horribly wrong with Donald Trump and President Zelenskyy. But that does not mean that the door was shut. The door was shut either on a future relationship between Trump and Zelenskyy, in fact, nor was it shut on the prospect of things getting better in Ukraine, some kind of peace deal, some kind of deal that the US want. And I think that the job that Keir Starmer spies himself being able to do, really, is to find the common ground there. Now, in some ways, things have worked out quite fortuitously for Keir Starmer. He had an incredibly well-received visit on Thursday night, and then he was able to pick up the phone to Donald Trump as well as Zelenskyy on Friday night, and again to Donald Trump on Saturday night. But I do think in politics, Yalda, you make your own luck, and it is the hard work of him and the team that have got them to this point where they're able to do exactly that. And that's really the kind of point of having everybody in that room at the moment. I think we counted 18 people turning up, leaders and foreign leaders alongside Keir Starmer. It's to look for where within the kind of below the sort of headlines, there are areas where progress can still be made. And Keir Starmer was giving us some sense of that this morning. He talked about the need for everyone to find a line. Now, that was the most intriguing thing that Keir Starmer said today. He talks about the need to negotiate a line between Russia and Ukraine. I think he meant a new physical border for Ukraine, which, if it is new as in different to what it was 3 years ago, will be seen as a loss. Keir Starmer not pressed on whether any of that could include territory that that Russia encroached in post 2022, but nevertheless, clearly that's one of the subjects up for grabs. Was Keir Starmer hinting that actually Ukraine was going to have to concede something? Donald Trump, for his part, clearly wants that minerals deal, but moreover, he wants a deal full stop. He wants his Nobel Peace Prize, and that really, again, gives you a little bit of an avenue in. So I never thought after Friday night things were quite as bad as some people said, because yes, the personality side and the optics were dreadful, but there are still the outlines of the makings of something. And then the question that none of us really know the answer to, which is Donald Trump planning to sit down with President Putin in order, sort of having effectively been quite nice and generous to him up to that point, in order to negotiate a really tough deal with him and get back almost all or all of the land lost by Ukraine? Or is there a bigger game in President Trump's mind that perhaps Europe wouldn't be so comfortable with, that sees Russia trying to be peeled off by President Trump from China, and therefore just altogether a slightly warmer relationship with Russia, which may not play out in Ukraine's interest? So there are still big imponderables that they can't know the answer to in that room, but there's no point in doing diplomacy if you don't do it in the spirit of optimism and in trying, and I think that's what's going to be going on in the room behind us.
Indeed, and to your point on all of those optics and things that could shift and change, and what is in the mind of President Trump with all of this, what the discussions in here are going to be is how do we put the best tangible plan together to present to the US president so that he can say, look, we've done our bit, we've brought Zelenskyy on board, we as Europe are going to step up, now we need you as security guarantees.
And your last question was in the context of Keir Starmer. Look, I think bluntly, Keir Starmer can make pretty much the best case of any leader in that room that he's had more conversations now, certainly in the last 4 days, than anybody else with President Trump. He can claim to know a bit more of the mind of where he is at the moment. He can claim with some credibility to be an ally who can take difficult messages in all directions. And everybody's going to have to swallow a bit of their pride diplomatically after the last few days, aren't they? So the role of Keir Starmer suddenly absolutely vital, absolutely central in all of this, and looking for those areas where progress can be made. But there do look like there are glimmers of light if played right if people are reading Donald Trump right in the more optimistic sense of what they think he wants to do.
Sam, so grateful for all of your analysis there in these very crucial and important times. Thank you so much. You're watching Sky News today. Coming up after the programme, we'll have, after the break rather, lots more. The PM is hosting world leaders for that summit to discuss the war in Ukraine. We'll have much more coming up. Stay with us.
First Minister, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning. Very
nice to see you. How are you feeling?
Looking forward to getting into the parliamentary chamber.
Are you any further forward to making a decision?
No, it's an important day today.
All of the claims were in line with my parliamentary duties, so I'm making that clear to you, Conor.
He was a Scot through and through.
He was a very good politician.
Alex Salmond was controversial, he was a disruptor, but above all, he was respected.
Will you resign if you lose this week?
Again, I'm not planning to, of course, lose the vote of no confidence. I'm planning to win that vote of no confidence.
His face said it all.
My intention to stand down as party leader.
This is now a storm with deadly consequences. How are they feeling?
They're a bit scared at the minute.
We've been told to evacuate.
How are you feeling?
Devastated.
Hundreds of homes were wiped out by flooding. I'm Conor Gillis, Sky's Scotland correspondent.
It was probably the darkest time in my life.
Scott is 5 years sober after a cocaine addiction left him close to death. Scotland has a shameful record, worse than England, the worst in Europe.
Why not just say you failed? Because then you might get more respect from families who've lost loved ones.
This is where one of the UK's most prolific rapists thought he'd got away with murder. Sky News can reveal that former sex workers had told police he was sexually violent.
My Emma.
Free wherever you get your news. It's over, isn't it? The Americans say he is Rossi, a fraudster. This has been one of the most bizarre cases ever heard in a courtroom in this country. A dangerous murderer. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Andrew Ennis after this?
She said she can forgive him, but as long as he's behind bars.
By doing the right thing, it's destroyed your life.
They terrorised me. They intimidated me.
Sky News, the full story first.
Welcome back to the programme. I'm Yalda Hakim, and we've been talking about this all-important, crucial summit hosted by Sir Keir Starmer here, where he's urged world leaders to step up for what is a once-in-a-generation moment to secure peace in Ukraine. He's hosting leaders from Europe and around the world in a bid to stabilise European security. And we've seen those European leaders arrived here at Lancaster House. And just this afternoon, as they gathered around President Zelenskyy, who has arrived here from Washington after what was an extraordinary blow-up between he and Donald Trump at the Oval Office. He has arrived here to the embrace of European leaders. And of course, we've been getting the pulse from all over the world. But our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, has more on what European leaders will have to prioritise when it comes to their defence strategy moving forward. Have a listen.
It's not just about the lack of capacity in the industrial base. It's also about the mindset of the companies. Why is a company like BAE Systems, the biggest British defence manufacturer, going to suddenly massively expand its production capacity for, say, for example, artillery shells without absolute guaranteed orders from the British government that it's going to have enough on its order books to last into the future? That may sound counterintuitive given the huge threat, but that has been a real restricting factor since Russia's full-scale invasion was launched more than 3 years ago now. Alarm bells rang back then in Western capitals across Europe, but unfortunately, because governments have lost that fundamental mindset that was a matter of second nature during the Cold War about the need to put defence and security and ensuring you have credible military capacity, depth, strategic reserves, an industrial base that can not just produce weapons at scale and speed, but also has the resilience and the supply chains to be able to keep on producing them in the moment of crisis. They forgot all of that, and so it requires prioritising defence above other nice-to-have peacetime priorities, such as, of course, the economy, health, social welfare, education, all of these things that successive governments for the past generation have focused on. Do you remember the saying, there's no votes in defence? There are votes in defence when there is a threat like there is right now in Europe, and that should have been plain to see ever since 2014, frankly, when Russia first tried to redraw the geography map when it invaded Crimea. But it's taken shockwave after shockwave, and here we are at this moment of absolute crisis where it's not just the threat from Russia that is alarming the UK and its allies. It's the threat of the United States moving away from Europe. And actually, it's got every right to do that in terms of being a member of the NATO alliance, but not being taken for granted by European militaries that have chosen not to maintain the kind of military capacity that America does. And America's capacity isn't endless. It too has had to, reduce spending, try to rationalise its defence industrial base, but it was doing it from a much bigger starting point. And I think that's what has been lost across Europe, in particular in the UK. Back during the two world wars, the Second World War, there was an enormous industrial base across the UK that was able to convert, for example, car factories into Spitfire factories. Imagine if we had to try to do that now. The entire industrial landscape has changed, has transformed, has lost that resilience. And so it's a moment of complete crisis and a moment of change that requires genuine, hard-headed leadership, which hopefully the Prime Minister is having these conversations now. But it's taken an awful long time, and it's been disappointing for those in defence circles to see that it's taken this long and to push the country and its allies to this point of danger and crisis for finally the blinkers to sort of be lifted and people to actually be staring at the problem. But the problem is huge, and as soon as you start thinking about it, you realise just how enormous a change is required if you really are going to get serious again.
Yeah, and that is the question, isn't it, Debs? I mean, we're 11 years since the annexation of Crimea. We are 8 years since Trump won, 3 years since the full-scale invasion, and yet it has been impossible to have these tangible conversations with European leaders about what they're going to do to up their defence spending. They pay the lip service, but they haven't actually put that into concrete action and prepared themselves for a moment like this.
And I think it's all to do with the fact that they haven't felt the threat. People in the UK haven't felt the existential threat that you absolutely feel when you're standing here in Ukraine, as you well know as well, when you're actually in a country where there are air raid sirens, missiles falling down, drone attacks, military forces engaged in World War II, World War I style trench warfare around this country, then of course here in Ukraine nothing else matters other than maintaining defence capabilities. But for Western Europe in particular, they haven't had to think about existential threat, at least since the end of the Cold War. World War II, it was a whole generations have passed since the end of World War II, and that idea of what a country's priorities should be has been allowed. I mean, it's very lucky, it's very fortunate that the peace dividend has enabled people to focus on more nice-to-haves than military hardware. But unfortunately, that has changed in the last 10 years. We've taken this holiday from history people talk about. And it is time, a lot of people say. It's overtime for the UK and its allies in particular to start making these hard decisions and reprioritising how they shape their economy, speak to their people. And if they really are going to want to harden their defences, given the threat landscape, and given the fact that America has said very clearly now, this is the second Trump administration, it's the same message as the first time round, that Europe needs to take a much greater burden when it comes to protecting itself.
That's Deborah Haynes reporting there from Kiev. You're watching Sky News Today, and coming up, as the Prime Minister hosts world leaders at a summit to try and bring peace to Ukraine, what hope have they got? I'll be speaking to Lord Darrett, the UK's former ambassador to the United States. Welcome back. Now, the Prime Minister has urged world leaders to step up for what is a once-in-a-generation moment to secure peace in Ukraine. He's hosting leaders from Europe and around the world in an effort to stabilise European security. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, has been monitoring events for us today and sent us this update.
There's a lot more at stake than just Ukraine, and to say just Ukraine obviously is an understatement. Ukraine is a hugely important conflict, and what happens in Ukraine will affect the rest of the world for a long time to come. But what has happened over the last few weeks, and particularly the last few days, has been seismic in what it might mean for the way the world is run, the way the world has been run by the West for 80 years since the Second World War. And that has been based on the idea of rules with some egregious exceptions. The West has tried to impose rules. So if you attack a neighbour, if you invade a neighbour with unprovoked aggression, you get punished. If you try and destabilise the world, you get punished, and there's an attempt to keep things stable and secure and prosperous. The fear is now we have a president who seems to have no patience for that and the organisations that underpinned it and the philosophy behind it. What Donald Trump seems to believe is effectively the survival of the strongest, certainly in the minds of sceptics and critics. And the fear is he seems to prefer resetting relations with another strong partner like Russia, potentially also China, and has contempt for weaker partners like Ukraine. And I think that impression has been reinforced massively by what we saw in the Oval Office at the end of last week. Whether or not, whoever started it, whether it was an ambush or not, the fact that the Vice President and the President continues to pummel and lay into this key ally, I think is reinforced in the minds of many their greatest fears. I think for European leaders meeting where you are, the worst-case scenario is America, under Donald Trump, has effectively switched sides. It certainly has diplomatically. We saw it do that in the UN in a vote last week. To the shock of many, might it do so in different ways? That is a very live concern, I'm sure, for European leaders. The best-case scenario is that America does seem to have become a rogue nation under Donald Trump. Either way, as Beth was saying there, it's not a reliable partner, and if it's not a reliable partner, it can't be relied upon to guarantee security in Europe, as it has been for 8 decades, and it can't be relied upon to enforce and underpin peace in Ukraine. So Europe has a huge challenge, and is Europe up to that? Is it up to it in a military sense and a political sense? So that's the challenge, I think, for leaders meeting where you are in Lancaster House. Can they show they have the ability to come up with a lot more defence spending, the kind of military muscle behind the new role that Europe might need to have if they are on their own in this new world order? And that's potentially a very live concern for them. But the implications of this, I think, are far-reaching. All the way to here, we're in Kisumu in Kenya. And another sort of outcome of the new Trumpian philosophy in Washington has been the cancellation of US aid. That has been a projection of soft power for America for decades. They have been brilliant at using soft power to extend their power and influence. But Donald Trump has cut all US aid. So to give you an idea of what that means here in Kenya, $850 million worth of aid has been given to Kenya every year. That effectively overnight was almost completely cut off. So we've been talking to health workers in tears, mothers with HIV weeping over their children, saying they have no idea what's going to happen next. And they are saying that thousands, tens of thousands could die here potentially in the coming weeks if there isn't a change of heart in Washington. So just to bring it back to Britain, we could have a scenario where Donald Trump goes to the palace, Buckingham Palace, for the state visit in a few months' time, at a time when tens of thousands of people are dying and have died because of what Donald Trump has done to US aid. So, you know, this is a completely new way of the world operating, has enormous ramifications, and the aftershocks of what happened in the Oval Office last week and from what we've seen in Washington over the last few weeks are potentially enormous, not just for Ukraine and Europe, but for the rest of the world as well.
As Dominic Waghorn reporting, their international affairs editor. And of course, that summit is ongoing at Lancaster House with 19 world leaders, including the Prime Minister, discussing how to try and bring about some kind of peace settlement for Ukraine. Let's bring in Elizabeth Braw, who's from the Atlantic Council, who's been with us all day, thankfully, with her expertise on diplomacy and these kinds of matters. Elizabeth Braw, thanks so much for being with us. That meeting is ongoing. Can you give us a sense of what we should be looking for afterwards when the meeting breaks up, and what kind of messaging we could expect to get from the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, when that meeting finishes?
I think we're all hoping for some sort of concrete measure that these leaders will hopefully have agreed on. Now, it's only one meeting, and it's not every European country. There was only space for some. And as Keir Starmer said, he has spoken with, for example, the Baltic leaders by phone. But nevertheless, these are a group of very important leaders in that room, and they are not there to chit-chat and proclaim general support of Ukraine. They are there to try to agree on some sort of concrete measures. I think that's what we'll be looking for when they emerge. Then clearly that is not going to be the last meeting they have. In fact, this is the beginning of what's likely to be a very long series of meetings involving them and other European leaders. And we should remember Canada is there as well. So we are not going to get the complete picture, or rather package today, but nevertheless, we are, I think, looking for and hoping for some concrete measure that they will hopefully have agreed on today.
We've just seen those two men there, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron walking in together. And there was some discussion this morning, wasn't there, from an interview that the Prime Minister gave, that the UK and France could be the ones to come up with some kind of peace proposal that they would then present to the United States, that would then go through the processes of hopefully being agreed eventually. There's been talk from those two leaders as well about putting troops into Ukraine, some kind of reassurance force. Do you think we could start to see the contours of that after this meeting, Elizabeth?
Maybe not after this meeting, but it is important, as you said, that the meeting is chaired by the UK with the assistance of France. These are Europe's arguably two most important military nations. They are also the two European nations represented on the UN Security Council as permanent members. They also happen to be two nations where we haven't had elections in recent days, as we have in Germany, and so that matters. These Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are going to be there, both of them, in their positions for a while longer, and they are also not entirely new in post. So they are operating from some basis of continuity and certainty, and they also seem to have mastered the art of forming some sort of bond with Donald Trump, so they can act as mediators from that perspective as well. All of this matters, and I think we should remember how important personalities are in international diplomacy. During World War II, it was the case that Charles de Gaulle was not particularly well liked, frankly, because he was a little bit obnoxious sometimes. He was not particularly well liked by Roosevelt and Churchill, but they managed to maintain some sort of relationship nonetheless, and that has been the case across the Western Alliance for many, many years now. Not every leader got along with everybody else. There were personality clashes, but what we saw on Friday was personality clashes spilling over into the public domain, and that's what makes that so unusual, that they weren't able to contain those personality differences and indeed policy differences. And that's why Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron are so crucial. Once again, they are there their role will be to try to manage that relationship and act as mediators. And again, they're doing so from the basis of the UK and France being very significant military powers as well.
Absolutely. All right, Elizabeth, really do appreciate your expertise and have done all throughout the day. Thank you so much for being with us, Elizabeth Broad, there from the Atlantic Council. And just to update you on the situation after that peace summit, it's at Lancaster House that's been convened, of course, by the Prime Minister. We are expecting to hear from Sir Keir Starmer at 5 p.m, where he will give a news conference, perhaps with some detail as to what was discussed around that table with those 18 other world leaders. And we'll bring that, of course, to you live here on Sky News when it starts around about 5. All right, let's bring in Lord Kim Darroch, former UK ambassador to the United States. Lord Darroch, it's really great to have you with us. Thanks so much for making the time this afternoon. Just first up, Ambassador, what have you made of the diplomatic dance we've had since that disaster on Friday with Zelenskyy coming here, those hugs, going to see the king, this sort of very careful choreography. What have you made of it all?
Well, first of all, last Friday was like something I have never seen in 40-odd years of diplomacy. You sometimes have very tough exchanges behind closed doors in summit meetings, but to have that played out in front of the world's media was extraordinary and unique and, frankly, made for very unpleasant viewing because it looked as if the president and the vice president were ganging up on Ukraine's leader, who has been an exceptionally courageous war leader. What you're seeing today is a very deliberate European attempt to redress the balance and to show at least that Europe is solidly behind the Ukrainian president and Ukraine as the party that was invaded. And we will see what the substance comes out is, but I would hope that there is something out of this afternoon's meeting about not just continued political support for Ukraine, but continued and preferably enhanced military and economic and other support for Ukraine, because they have to face up to the reality or the likelihood that there is not going to be American military aid coming once the consignment that was agreed and signed off by Joe Biden is finished.
Are we in a position where you think, Lord Derek, that we can trust the United States and trust the Trump administration?
In a way, you have to kind of trust the Prime Minister when he says he believes he can trust Donald Trump. Look, I think that it's clear that the Trump vision of a deal on Ukraine is not the European vision. I think that he would be prepared to say to the Ukrainians, you must either give up the territory you've lost and give up your aspirations to join NATO, and then you can get at least a ceasefire. And the Europeans aren't at the moment in that place. So there are differences, I think, on the substance of any potential deal. But in terms of if ultimately you can get Donald Trump to promise a US backstop for any European deterrence force in Ukraine, and whether you can promise you can trust that Donald Trump will try and push forward any proposals that he agrees with that are coming out of this British-French process with Putin, then we have to take Keir Starmer's word that he does try.
Right. I mean, what do you think, Lord Derek? I mean, you know the man a bit, don't you? I think it's fair to say. Do you think he will have thought at all about what happened on Friday evening and reflected on what happened in that Oval Office?
Look, I'm not sure whether he will have had any remorse over that. I kind of doubt it. What I do think he will be thinking about is he'll be thinking about that meeting that he hopes to have with Putin, where he announces in front of the world media that he and Putin have done a deal. And I imagine that both Macron and the Prime Minister made the point to him, if you want the acclamation that you might expect after that announcement, it needs to be a fair deal which shows that you have run some concessions out of Putin. If it's a capitulation, people are not going to be impressed. So I think we can make an argument that will make an impression on Donald Trump around how this will look if he wants it to be his place in the history books.
Lord Derek, always good to speak with you. Sorry it was so short, but we do appreciate you making the time to speak to us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
All right, you're watching Sky News Today, and coming up next, all eyes on London and Lancaster House as Europe's leaders gather to try and work out a path to peace for Ukraine.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We start with breaking news.
An historic day here today.
The golden age of America begins right now.
A long-awaited ceasefire is now underway.
First question, Sky News.
This is a huge moment. It's incredible. Now to California.
Do you owe citizens an apology? Have you nothing to say?
Jane Secker, Sky News. Would you like to respond to us now?
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
In principle, would you agree to do that?
Criticism of you is banned. How is this a fair election?
The cameras are poised, waiting to see what the president might do next.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky's security and defence editor. I've covered Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin.
Sky News. Get the full story first.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent. Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back. You're watching Sky News Today and our continuing coverage of the summit being convened by the Prime Minister at Lancaster House in an attempt to bring peace to Ukraine. 19 leaders there, including the Prime Minister. And outside, our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, who joins us now live for his analysis of what is going on behind you. Sam, afternoon to you. So look, they are still talking as we understand it. We're expecting a news conference from the Prime Minister at 5 o'clock. And this is a huge moment for the Prime Minister, for Europe and for the world.
That's right, Kamali. I mean, in some ways, some people might think that Keir Starmer is a lucky general. He, of course, had his meeting with Donald Trump in the White House just on Thursday lunchtime. That went, well, as far as we could tell from all of the optics, extraordinarily well, and certainly the number 10 team were very pleased with it. But I do think, Kamali, that in politics you make your own luck, and there is a reason why Keir Starmer is today the host of, well, you can see it on the signs behind me, what's being called the London Summit. Him and 18 other leaders sitting around a table working out what to do next, what to do after that disastrous White House meeting on Friday lunchtime with President Zelenskyy. I think Keir Starmer's job behind closed doors is for a couple of things. First of all, as he has done all the way along in the last couple of days, really to encourage everyone to take down the temperature. You saw how on Friday night things got heated, both the president and initially the vice president, J.D. Vance, really winding up President Zelenskyy, who some might think unwisely bit back, and it all descended into something of a fracas in the Oval Office. Keir Starmer saying, look, in order to get the best possible peace deal for Ukraine, as much on Ukraine's terms as possible, we have to avoid ratcheting up that rhetoric. There have been some, like the new German Chancellor, who, interesting, isn't here. It's still Olaf Scholz while those coalition negotiations go along. But some in German politics still ratcheting up the pressure. Keir Starmer's message to everybody, I think, will be that is not helpful at this critical moment, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of Europe as well. And secondly, I think they'll be exploring some of the ideas that Donald Trump has been talking about, perhaps with a greater seriousness than we've seen before. And I say that because we've seen a little bit from Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, this morning on the US TV networks talking about what needs to be done. Now, Ukraine has been somewhat resistant to talk of an immediate ceasefire because President Zelenskyy fears that would mean ceding too much land, ceding too much of the space that Russia has taken. But I understand Britain will be pushing people to embrace that language. It's those kind of detailed discussions going on behind me. I think the leaders will be in there for just a few more minutes. I'm expecting some of the leaders to start leaving just after 4 o'clock. Keir Starmer has got a press conference at 5. It'll be him alone wanting to take the glory for this moment. And I think people will really want to hear what he has to say.
Indeed. All right, Sam, for now, outside of Lancaster House, thank you for that. And as Sam was saying, we will hear from the Prime Minister at 5 p.m. today, the end of what is being called the London Summit, a summit convened of European leaders as well as the leaders of the European Commission and Council there to try and bring a peace deal to Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, of course, in London for those talks. We'll have the very latest in the next hour of the programme. Good afternoon. It is 4 o'clock. This is Sky News Today with Kamali Melbourne. Your headlines.
Have you spoken to President Trump, sir?
Things up with Donald Trump.
A critical day for the continent and its security as the Prime Minister greets President Zelenskyy for a Ukraine summit. Leaders have gathered in London to discuss a way forward on a ceasefire plan to present to the United States.
We're gathered here today because this is a once-in-a-generation moment for the security of Europe, and we all need to step up.
So Keir Starmer hoping countries will pledge to improve their spending on defence and move quickly to back Kyiv. But will the leaders agree? And a royal appointment. Later on, President Zelenskyy will travel to Sandringham to meet King Charles. Prime Minister has urged leaders to step up at a once-in-a-generation moment for the security of Europe at the beginning of a summit to try and bring peace to Ukraine. So Keir Starmer has welcomed a host of leaders from across the world focused on the plight of Kyiv. Now, in light of America's apparent withdrawal from European affairs, the Prime Minister is urging those gathered today to boost spending on defence as he tries to shore up support for President Zelenskyy. Well, the 18 visiting leaders arrived at Lancaster House posing for the family photograph, alongside, of course, the Prime Minister and Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, as well as Emmanuel Macron. Well, the Prime Minister opened discussions by welcoming all there and addressed the absence of leaders of Baltic states.
Can I just say welcome, everyone. It's really fantastic to see you here, and thank you very much for being here. Obviously, I want to say a particular welcome to President Zelenskyy, Vladimir. You heard, I think, last night when you arrived at Downing Street, the crowds outside cheering. That was totally spontaneous. They had learned that you'd arrived, they knew you were visiting, and they wanted to come and show the strength of feeling in relation to Ukraine. And so I think and hope you know that we're all with you, people of Ukraine, for as long as it takes, and everyone around this table. So it's very, very good to have you here. We're gathered here today because this is a once-in-a-generation moment for the security of Europe, and we all need to step up. Getting a good outcome for Ukraine is not just a matter of right and wrong. It's vital for the security of every nation here, and many others too. I spoke to our Baltic allies this morning. Together, they obviously are part of our discussion, and all of Ukraine's partners have to meet this moment and grab it with both hands. And in my conversations over recent days, we've agreed that a group of us will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting, and then discuss that with the US and take it forward together. And that's really important. And that was the focus of my discussions with Volodymyr yesterday, and then with President Trump and President Macron. And it's an important step forward after Friday. Today's meeting is a moment to unite around this effort, to discuss how we can deliver a just and enduring peace together, and to make sure Ukraine can defend and deter against any future Russian attacks. And we're going to discuss how we can deliver more support to Ukraine now, because even while Russia talks about peace, they're continuing their relentless aggression. So that's the agenda, and we need to agree what steps come out of this meeting to deliver peace through strength for the benefit of all of us.
Well, once that summit wraps up, we are expecting the Prime Minister to hold a news conference at 5 o'clock. We'll bring that to you live, of course. Let's go to Lancaster House and outside on our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Sam, good afternoon to you. So, look, we heard there from the Prime Minister laying out the agenda of the meeting and some of the things that he wants to be discussed. But what will it look like at the end of this meeting in the news conference for us to say that it's been a success and we've moved forward?
Well, in an hour, Keir Starmer will give that news conference, I think, looking like he wants to own the moment. You saw really in the pictures around the table inside Lancaster House, the building behind me, that something of a kind of new European order there, with Keir Starmer in the middle, President Macron on our left, and Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president, on his right. The voices trying to take down the temperature now after that Friday night bust-up, or Friday lunchtime, American time bust-up at the White House. Now, I think the aims for this summit are several-fold, and we'll be told it was a success, because regardless of what went on in the room, because we don't get a complete transcript of everything was said. But I think the aims are several-fold. First of all, I think most of all, it will just be about trying to take some of the fiery rhetoric out of the discussion. There were both personality clashes on Friday night, but perhaps more importantly, there are big differences in position between the UK, the US and Ukraine. And I think that what Keir Starmer's trying to do is to look to try and bridge some of those things. He sees his role at the moment as a bridge between Europe and the US, and I think actually that will involve trying to close some of the policy differences, the disagreements that you've got. So take one, for example, President Zelenskyy somewhat reluctant, somewhat resistant to calls for, in Donald Trump's language, an immediate ceasefire, because the Ukrainian president just sees that really that could mean some of the land that Russia succeeded in taking in the last 3 years ending permanently under Russian control. Well, we can see from the interview that Peter Mandelson's been given to George Stephanopoulos on ABC, American network this morning, really to sort of embrace some of the language. He's urging the Ukrainians and the Europeans to embrace some of the language of an immediate ceasefire. So you can see that's something perhaps that the Europeans might not have immediately thought to do. They were calling for Ukraine to be at the negotiating table. Maybe there's a shift there that could on one level appease Ukraine, on another appease Donald Trump, and just end up in a situation where the two sides feel like they're less at loggerheads. There are some very difficult issues arising from Friday night. That includes the demand that was reiterated on American networks this morning that maybe President Zelenskyy should offer some kind of apology for how he conducted himself in the White House on Friday lunchtime. That's a hugely contested issue. But I think the most important thing that you'll hear today is A, that there's unity on the European side, B, that everybody backs Ukraine, but C, you will just hear some of the anti-Trump or anti-American administration rhetoric just calm down a bit, and that will be Keir Starmer's doing.
Indeed. All right, Sam, for now, thank you for that. And as we say, we're expecting to hear from the Prime Minister at 5 p.m. Of course, we'll bring you that news conference live. Let's bring in Elizabeth Broyce, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, who's been with us all day, providing her expertise on this moment that we find ourselves in. Elizabeth, thanks so much for being with us throughout the day. What do you think we're going to hear from the Prime Minister? We heard him laying out his agenda for what he wants to get done from this meeting, but of course, coming out at the end of that discussion, those few hours that he's had with those world leaders, he will have wanted to progress this somewhat.
Yes, they are not. The leaders are not there to simply offer support, verbal support to Ukraine. These are clearly very busy politicians who have come to London to try to hash out at least some sort of initial agreements involving what they can do for Ukraine, and indeed how some sort of peace arrangement can be brought a little bit closer to happening. So there is massive pressure on these leaders to come up with something, both because the US administration has the fire to their feet, and also because it really is their responsibility now, since the Americans have more or less declared that they are not that interested in helping Ukraine anymore. And also from a Ukrainian humanitarian perspective, as the Ukrainian MP who was on your show earlier said, Ukrainians are feeling the trauma of this war every single day. Nobody wants an end to it more than the Ukrainians themselves. So there are massive opportunities here for Keir Starmer to show his skills as a global negotiator, even though he's new in the position, relatively new in the position as Prime Minister. This is the opportunity for him to show his diplomatic skill. He showed it in Washington a couple of days ago. Now he's being called upon to show it again. So I think we can't expect particularly detailed plans after just one meeting, but the leaders are likely to present some sort of a concrete result, because otherwise it would look like they just came to have a nice discussion and provide verbal support to Ukraine.
Yeah, no one needs just a nice discussion at this stage in the war. And Elizabeth, I mean, look, we're a few days on from what happened on Friday night in the Oval Office. We've heard a lot from Trump and Vance in the lead up to this weekend about bringing this war to a close. But now we're really seeing it from the Europeans, aren't we? Really seeing them talk about ceasefire, talk about trying to resolve this war in a really just way, in an immediate way as well, not just when it's ready for the Ukrainians to sign up to the deal, but them trying to take the lead. So we've taken a step into a new arena in this, haven't we?
We have, and if we once a conversation moves to talking about the ceasefire, then the immediate question that raises: so who is going to ensure that that ceasefire is honored, and then what are the next steps after that? So the ceasefire is just that is a technical step. The aggression ceases, but how do you move from there to peace? And I think that is the point that President Zelenskyy was trying to make in America. Peace is not just a ceasefire. It's all the arrangements that should come with a ceasefire that will allow the attacked country to live in security, and that's considerable arrangements we've seen in other parts of the world. Just how difficult it is to ensure the ceasefire. You can negotiate the ceasefire all you want, but who is going to guarantee it? What are going to be the arrangements that prevent the aggressor from attacking again?
Really interesting, because that's the opposite way around that Donald Trump had suggested. He said that securing the peace is the easy part, but the ceasefire is the hard deal. But anyway, Elizabeth, we really do appreciate your analysis, of course, here on Sky News. Thanks so much for being with us. I just want to show you the latest footage that we have coming in from central London of a helicopter arriving at Buckingham Palace. Now, it is our understanding that the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, will be making his way to Sandringham once that London summit wraps up to meet with King Charles. It's not clear whether or not this helicopter will be the one that carries him, but we have been monitoring the situation. This has been filmed by a Sky News camera operator on the Mall, and this is the scene there now. As you can see, that chopper still on the ground, rotor blades going. That conversation, the summit, is still underway. It's Lancaster House, which is, central London, not very far away at all from Buckingham Palace. And we are expecting President Volodymyr Zelenskyy to be meeting King Charles at Sandringham this afternoon. And of course, we'll keep an eye on all relevant dignitaries throughout the afternoon here. All right, well, let's speak now to Leslie Shedd. She's a former senior advisor for the US House Committee on Foreign Affairs. Leslie Shedd, thanks so much for making the time to speak to us today. I mean, where to begin with all of this? Because it's moving so quickly at the moment. Just give us a sense, if you can, on the US reaction in the days now that have passed from that Friday evening event in the Oval Office, and how much support for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance's attack on Zelenskyy the Trump administration seems to have.
I would say the very first kind of response that anybody had was shock. I mean, I watched it with my mouth agape. I have been a part of many closed-door bilateral meetings with leaders all over the world, and those kinds of conversations sometimes do happen, but never really in front of a television camera. So the initial was just shock, and then after that was grave concern about what happens next for Ukraine, what this means for Europe, and what this means in general for global security. I think with regards to what people think about President Trump here, look, President Zelenskyy was told repeatedly by his biggest allies in Congress and in the United States that he needed to come here, he needed to sign this deal, and that he needed to say thank you, and that this was going to help reset the relationship with President Trump. It was going to help him and help his country. And instead, he took the bait in that meeting. And I genuinely wish he would not have done that. I wish that we could have stopped that from happening. But, as Secretary of State Rubio said this morning, as well as Ambassador Mandelson said this morning, now is the time for a reset. And I'm really hopeful that can happen.
Yeah, there was talk as well on the morning shows as well that it was not an ambush, it wasn't a setup. But Mike Waltz, the National Security Director, has said that it was just clear that Zelenskyy wasn't quite ready to have that conversation. I mean,
he feels very passionate. I mean,
100%.
Right. I mean, I understand that, right? I mean, his people are being slaughtered every day, and he is desperately trying to keep his country still existing. I mean, of course he is very passionate about that, but when it comes to diplomacy, sometimes you just kind of have to bite the bullet and say what you're supposed to and get through. This mineral deal would have been a great thing for his country. And I think it still is possible. I want to be very clear. I definitely think it still is possible. But the President Trump doesn't see foreign policy in the same way that, somebody like my former boss, Chairman McCall, necessarily does. He sees things very transactionally, and this would have been a good way to get them back on the right footing.
Leslie, not to over-litigate again what happened on Friday, because I think many people want to kind of move on from what we all had to witness in the Oval Office. But I guess Zelenskyy knew what had been said by J.D. Vance in the past about the withdrawal of support. He knows what Donald Trump has said in the past about US support for Ukraine. And there is this threat now in the past day or so that support could withdraw even further. Are we getting closer to that? Is that something that the president, is still sort of hanging over everyone's heads, that the US could seek to withdraw even further and not supply any more arms to Ukraine?
I sincerely hope not, but honestly, I am afraid of that right now. Right now, the President Trump is still allowing weapons to come through. He is still allowing, us to continue to send the arms over to Ukraine. And those weapons are incredibly critical to Ukraine's defense. And I am concerned about whether or not that will continue.
What support is there in Congress for that to continue? Because that's the other side of this. The executive branch, of course, has its own sort of path to plough on this. But in terms of congressional support, where are we with Ukraine at the moment? Because I have seen the reports from Lindsey Graham, who said exactly what you said in the first answer, that, Zelenskyy really needed to come to the Oval Office, come to the White House and meet these two people on the level and listen to what they said and behave humbly.
So, look, I want to make it very clear. There is still very strong bipartisan, bicameral support in the United States Congress for Ukraine, for supplying weapons to Ukraine. There is still a very strong bipartisan, bicameral caucus of members of Congress who absolutely believe that Vladimir Putin was the aggressor, that he cannot be trusted, and that Ukraine is a democracy that we need to be helping. But the meeting did not make that easy for those people. This is not a helpful tool. And I think what you saw with Lindsey Graham was a frustration. He felt like, look, I'd set you up with this. I helped you. I have put my own political capital on the line. I've used my political capital, not just with my voters back home, some of whom don't necessarily support this, but also with President Trump, and sat down and defended you and said how important this was. And they feel like it was blown because he couldn't keep his temper. And again, I want to be clear. I 100% understand why he was so frustrated. I absolutely understand why he's so passionate about this, but it just wasn't helpful.
Will an apology make all the difference?
Yes. Absolutely. And I think, too, that one of the things that I feel like has been kind of lost in all of this is that President Zelenskyy, English is not his first language. I have been in foreign countries and met with people, and there are certain idioms that people use and catchphrases that when translated don't sound that great, right? And I think that he can sit down and explain, look, this whole situation, I was lost in translation. English is not my first language. And I am sorry that I allowed this situation to devolve. I am sorry across on both sides, that both sides allowed tensions to boil over. And I want to reset. And I think that would make all the difference in the world.
I wonder if Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance would like to apologise as well, but I suppose that remains to be seen.
Yes.
Sure. It does indeed. All right, Leslie Shedd, really do appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
All right, let's take you back live to Lancaster House, central London, where that London summit with 19 leaders, including the Prime Minister, is still underway, discussing attempts to try and bring peace to Ukraine. The Prime Minister has already told us today that the plan is for the UK and France to work on a peace agreement alongside Ukraine, then present that to the United States, of course, following on from that disastrous meeting in the Oval Office on Friday evening between President Zelenskyy, President Trump and J.D. Vance. We're going to, of course, keep an eye on what's happening at Lancaster House. We're expecting some of the leaders to leave pretty soon. The Prime Minister will be speaking at 5 p.m. Now, just across the road, if you know central London, Buckingham Palace, and we are keeping an eye on that that chopper there because the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is due for a meeting with King Charles at Sandringham. And it is perhaps likely that that could, in fact, be the helicopter that will be transporting him. No clarity on that yet, but we're going to keep a close eye on that chopper, which in the last half an hour or so touched down in the grounds of Buckingham Palace, and see when it's up in the air and where it's off to. All right, well, stay with us here on Sky News today. Plenty more to come after this short break.
First Minister, how are you?
Good morning. Good morning.
Nice to see you. How are you feeling?
Looking forward to getting into the parliamentary chamber.
Are you any further forward to making a decision?
No, it's an important day today.
All of the claims were in line with my parliamentary duties, so I'm making that clear to you, Conor.
He was a Scot through and through.
He was a very good politician.
Alex Salmond was controversial, he was a disruptor, but above all, he was respected. Will you resign if you lose this week?
Again, I'm not planning to, of course, lose the vote of no confidence. I'm planning to win that vote of no confidence.
His face said it all.
My intention to stand down as party leader.
This is now a storm with deadly consequences. How are they feeling?
They're a bit scared at the minute.
We've been told to evacuate. How are you feeling?
Devastated.
Hundreds of homes were wiped out by flooding. I'm Conor Gillis, Sky's Scotland correspondent.
It was probably the darkest time in my life.
Scott is 5 years sober after a cocaine addiction left him close to death. Scotland has a shameful record, worse than England, the worst in Europe. Why not just say you failed? Because then you might get more respect from families who've lost loved ones. This is where one of the UK's most prolific rapists thought he'd got away with murder. Sky News can reveal that former sex workers had told police he was sexually violent.
My Emma.
Free wherever you get your news. It's over, isn't it? The Americans say he is Rossi, a fraudster. This has been one of the most bizarre cases ever heard in a courtroom in this country. A dangerous murderer. Do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Andrew Ennis after this?
She said she can forgive him, but as long as he's behind bars.
By doing the right thing, it's destroyed your life.
They terrorised me. They intimidated me.
Sky News, the full story first.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah.
The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone, and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Welcome back now. So Keir Starmer is urging world leaders to step up for what is a once-in-a-generation moment to try and secure peace for Ukraine. He's hosting leaders from Europe and around the world in an effort to stabilise European security. Well, our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, has been monitoring events and sent us this update.
There's a lot more at stake than just Ukraine, and to say just Ukraine obviously is an understatement. Ukraine is a hugely important conflict, and what happens in Ukraine will affect the rest of the world for a long time to come. But what has happened over the last few weeks, and particularly the last few days, has been seismic in what it might mean for the way the world is run, the way the world has been run by the West for 80 years since the Second World War. And that has been based on the idea of rules with some egregious exceptions. The West has tried to impose rules. So if you attack a neighbour, if you invade a neighbour with unprovoked aggression, you get punished. If you try and destabilise the world, you get punished, and there's an attempt to keep things stable and secure and prosperous. The fear is now we have a president who seems to have no patience for that, and the organisations that underpinned it and the philosophy behind it. What Donald Trump seems to believe is effectively the survival of the strongest, certainly in the minds of sceptics and critics. And the fear is he seems to prefer resetting relations with another strong partner like Russia, potentially also China, and has contempt for weaker partners like Ukraine. And I think that impression has been reinforced massively by what we saw in the Oval Office at the end of last week. Whether or not, whoever started it, whether it was an ambush or not, the fact that the Vice President and the President continues to pummel and lay into this key ally, I think has reinforced in the minds of many their greatest fears. I think for European leaders meeting where you are, the worst-case scenario is America, under Donald Trump, has effectively switched sides. It certainly has diplomatically. We saw it do that in the UN in a vote last week. To the shock of many, might it do so in different ways? That is a very live concern, I'm sure, for European leaders. The best-case scenario is that America does seem to have become a rogue nation under Donald Trump. Either way, as Beth was saying there, it's not a reliable partner, and if it's not a reliable partner, it can't be relied upon to guarantee security in Europe, as it has been for 8 decades, and it can't be relied upon to enforce and underpin peace in Ukraine. So Europe has a huge challenge, and is Europe up to that? Is it up to it in a military sense and a political sense? So that's the challenge, I think, for leaders meeting where you are in Lancaster House. Can they show they have the ability to come up with a lot more defence spending, the kind of military muscle behind the new role that Europe might need to have if they are on their own in this new world order? And that's potentially a very live concern for them. But the implications of this, I think, are far-reaching. All the way to here, we're in Kisumu in Kenya. And another sort of outcome of the new Trumpian philosophy in Washington has been the cancellation of US aid. That has been a projection of soft power for America for decades. They have been brilliant at using soft power to extend their power and influence, but Donald Trump has cut all US aid. So to give you an idea of what that means here in Kenya, $850 million worth of aid has been given to Kenya every year. That effectively overnight was almost completely cut off. So we've been talking to health workers in tears, mothers with HIV weeping over their children, saying they have no idea what's going to happen next. And they are saying that thousands, tens of thousands could die here potentially in the coming weeks if there isn't a change of heart in Washington. So just to bring it back to Britain, we could have a scenario where Donald Trump goes to the palace, Buckingham Palace, for the state visit in a few months' time, at a time when tens of thousands of people are dying and have died because of what Donald Trump has done to US aid. So, you know, this is a completely new way of the world operating, has enormous ramifications, and the aftershocks of what happened in the Oval Office last week and from what we've seen in Washington over the last few weeks are potentially enormous, not just for Ukraine and Europe, but for the rest of the world as well.
That's Dominic Waghorn reporting there. Let's take a look at the weather.
A bright start and always a warm welcome. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the next few days are going to be largely dry and settled. Those spells of wet and windy weather will try to move in from the northwest. Earlier, cloudy and damp conditions will linger over northern England this evening, but most of the places are fine with clear skies. Rain's moving into northwest Scotland and the Northern Isles, along with a risk of coastal gales. Wet and windy weather moves south tonight, weakening as it reaches Northern Ireland and northern England. Further south, it'll be cold under clear skies and there'll be a widespread frost and fog. It remains dry on Monday with freezing fog lifting and clearing. Thicker cloud will bring patchy light rain to parts of western Scotland, Northern Ireland, northwest England and much of Ireland. It remains windy in northern Scotland with rain there too. Temperatures will be near to or a little above average, making it feel spring-like in the sunshine and the light winds, but further north, strong winds and showers will persist for the Northern Isles.
A bright start and always a warm welcome. Qatar Airways sponsors the weather.
OK, well, let's just show the latest live pictures that we have from Lancaster House, where the London summit has been held. Some 19 world leaders, including the Prime Minister, gathered to try and work out a way to bring peace to Ukraine. The leaders will be departing soon. The Prime Minister will be speaking at 5 p.m. We'll bring it to you live. More to come after this short break.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. Let's take you live now to outside of Lancaster House in central London, where those European leaders and the Prime Minister, as well as the Prime Minister of Canada, have been meeting today. A peace summit convened to try and come up with a ceasefire deal for Ukraine. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, is standing by for us and joins us now live. Sam, good to have you with us. We're hearing, we will hear, from the Prime Minister at 5 p.m. Once that summit wraps up, we're expecting those leaders to start departing. Just take us through some of the agenda points that we heard from the Prime Minister earlier and what we may hear from him when he gives that news conference later on.
Well, it's about 3 hours since the first leader arrived here at Lancaster House for what's being billed as the London summit. And just in the background, you can probably hear the roar of the, or not quite roar, but the engine sounds as we expect very, very imminently those world leaders to start departing. Look, it's been a tricky summit, albeit a good one, I suspect, for Keir Starmer. He's been trying to take down the temperature. He's been trying to calm frayed nerves after that encounter in the White House between President Zelenskyy and Donald Trump on Friday lunchtime. But very, very difficult items on the agenda as he tries to bridge that gap between Ukraine and some Europeans and the Americans. I suspect the two most difficult things, Kamali, on the one hand, there is the question of how many troops European nations might be able to commit. France and the UK are clearly in the lead in terms of arguing that they are prepared to commit their own forces on the ground in Ukraine. So today we'll have seen an appeal to the 17 others who haven't yet done that to maybe follow suit, as they emphasise, as Lord Mandelson, the ambassador to Washington, did on the telly this morning, that this is Europe's problem, and Europe's problem predominantly, whatever the nature of the guarantee. And there is President Zelenskyy walking out on his way to Buckingham Palace to see King Charles, and then on to Sandringham, the Ukrainian president, the first to leave the summit, as he walking straight into the car, the presidential car, preparing to leave. And off he goes. I suspect he'll go into Buckingham Palace in order to get a helicopter that will take him to Sandringham, where he will meet the King, by far and away the most important attendee of the 19 figures at this summit, with a healthy entourage, healthy convoy following behind him. And we would now expect the other world leaders to leave in fairly short order, Kamali. President Zelenskyy appealing to those other...
And Sam, look, as we're watching these images now, we've got a live shot of what we think is going to be the RAF Super Puma that will carry President Zelenskyy from central London to Sandringham to meet with King Charles. Just coming, let's not forget, a few days after that invitation was given by the Prime Minister to President Trump for that state visit. Now, after that debacle in the Oval Office on Friday nights, President Zelenskyy in this country on his way to meet the monarch. We're looking at now live pictures of the Mall. Police outriders have arrived to clear the way. It's not a long journey at all, is it, from Lancaster House to the palace? And we'll just stick with these pictures for a moment, Sam, as the motorcade makes its way into Buckingham Palace to get, we think, put President Zelenskyy on that chopper for the flight to Sandringham, which will take about 40 minutes, we predict. He's going into Wellington Barracks now, just off the Mall of central London, where he's going to get on that helicopter and make his way to Sandringham. Now, Sam, you're still with us, I understand it. So, look, President Zelenskyy on his way there. Just talk to us a little bit about the sort of diplomatic moves that we're seeing right here, Sam, from Zelenskyy flying in straight from the US after the Oval Office meeting, to that hug from Sir Keir Starmer, to meeting the King.
That's right, and if you can hear overhead helicopter, which I strongly suspect potentially contains President Zelenskyy. Look, this is a very difficult moment for him, and one of the trickiest elements of the discussion that I would expect that has been taking place in the building behind me, if indeed it wasn't too sensitive even to get into now, has been this question of the American position on whether or not Ukraine may ultimately, as part of this peace deal, have to cede some of the land that Russia has taken control of over the last 3 years, subsequent to its invasion 3 years ago of Ukrainian territory. You just have that sense from the Americans that they are prepared to concede more than any European or the previous US administration when it comes to this. Indeed, you had the National Security Advisor, Donald Trump's national security, out on the telly this morning on CNN. This is Mike Waltz saying that this will clearly clearly involves some type of territorial concession for security guarantees going forward. Territorial concession, that was not on the agenda just a few weeks ago. It was something I think that leaders would have wanted to avoid. So European leaders, Keir Starmer, certainly that hasn't been the UK's position, that we'd be prepared to see that. Now, when you hear Keir Starmer talk on the telly, he talks about, this morning he talked about the line and negotiating where that line lies. The discussion about ending this war in Ukraine has changed in complexion. So for President Zelenskyy, I suspect that there are very, very difficult moments to hear that he may not be able to achieve his widely and repeatedly stated aim, that he maintains the original 2019 or even 2022 or even 2014 territorial integrity of his country by repelling the Russians. That may now no longer be possible. Whether that was discussed at this summit, Kamali, I think is going to be one of the big questions that we'll hear about in the press conference with the Prime Minister in a little over 20 minutes. That's when that's expected. Just to give you a little bit of an update about what's going on, the world's media are lined up alongside me. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, who, it has to be said, has played second fiddle to President Macron and other European figures and to Keir Starmer, is just giving a short address to some of the media a couple of metres down from where I am right now. We're listening to, we're across what she's saying, and she's been saying that in those remarks to journalists just now, she says that Europe really needs to step up massively and have a surge in defence spending. She's been at the forefront of arguing Europe needs to borrow more to spend more on defence recently. We urgently needed to rearm Europe. We want the US to know that we are ready to defend democracy. Now, I think that gives you a bit of an insight, Kamali, into the kinds of things that we have been discussed in that summit, because I suspect that as far as is possible, Keir Starmer, President Macron and President Zelenskyy will want the attendees at this conference to speak with one voice now, led by Keir Starmer in 20 minutes. But one of the big messages from the leaders will be whether or not, or basically a commitment as far as possible that European nations will increase their defence spending. A minority of them, I think it's about a third, not yet hitting that 2%, even the 2% of NATO, of their spending on their GDP towards military and defence. So a commitment from European nations to spend more, potentially through borrowing, particularly in the case of Germany, I think seems to be on the agenda, with Ursula von der Leyen looking to make that message absolutely clear. Ursula von der Leyen addressing the journalists here, but it seems to me the audience for her comments very much the White House, making clear that Europe is prepared to do what Keir Starmer did last week, announcing the increase to 2.5% of UK spending on defence. Now, the President of the European Commission echoing the need, not quite as specifically, but making clear that she will do what she can to make sure member states in the European Union up their defence spending. A message for the White House, as well as a message after that conference, gives you the first indication of the things that they're always likely to be on the agenda, but confirmation of what was on the agenda there.
Look, thank you for that. We're keeping an eye on that chopper at Wellington Barracks now. If you look quite closely, you will see a Ukrainian flag there. We do think that may well be the army helicopter flown by RAF pilots, which will take President Zelenskyy from central London to Sandringham for his audience with the King. And Sam, just on Ursula von der Leyen and those plans for Europe to spend more, there are some lines that are dropping from that interview that she's had. She said that member states do need more fiscal space to surge defence spending. And this is reiterating something that she said before, if you remember back to the Munich Security Conference back on the 14th of February, talking about this escape clause for defence payments, it's a mechanism within the EU that allows member states to spend more in emergencies. And she said that it could be used for defence. But I guess the question will be whether that has to be a unified thing, doesn't it? Because there are some within Europe, I'm thinking about the Hungarian leader Viktor Orban, who does not follow what Brussels plans, and whether or not that has to be a unified thing for all European nations to agree to, or whether individual member states can actually decide they're going to trigger that clause.
There are always moments in European politics where all the 27 don't speak with one necessarily with one voice. But I think the job of Ursula von der Leyen today is to rise above slight differences of emphasis, or even a minority of countries that might pull in another direction. Listen to this language, Kamali. This is from Ursula von der Leyen as well. Our message to America: we are ready to defend democracy, to defend the principle that there is a rule of law and you cannot invade your neighbour, you cannot change borders with force, and now common interest, there is a common interest to prevent future wars. Now, that's quite significant, that's quite interesting. That is Ursula von der Leyen coming out and opposing Russia from being able to keep any of the territory that it received when it subsequent to its 2022 invasion of Ukraine, suggesting that the EU, the European Commission, of which she is president, would reject any proposal that involved that. Just at the point where, as you heard me talk about a moment ago, the US National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was talking about potentially there needing to be some kind of sovereignty, land deal for sovereignty deal, land for sovereignty deal. Let's just take a little look at some of the faces that are coming out of the summit right now. You can see the sort of hive of activity, the national cars, the national leaders. It's a really complicated logistical job when you have 18 different national leaders and senior figures in politics, because the security concerns are absolutely uppermost in everybody's minds around here. And there is a lockdown on this area around Lancaster House. For those that don't know it, it's just adjacent to Clarence House.
Interrupt you, but we'll come back to Sam very shortly outside Lancaster House, because as you can see, that chopper is now leaving Wellington Barracks. We have been wondering whether or not that would be the vehicle that will be transporting President Zelenskyy from central London to Sandringham for an audience with King Charles III. We'll keep an eye on that chopper. We saw the motorcade, of course, leaving Lancaster House a very short time ago as that leaders' summit wraps up. And now the next appointment for President Zelenskyy, who's left Lancaster House after that summit has finished, is with King Charles III on the Sandringham estate. We'll keep an eye on that helicopter. It's about a 40-minute flight to Sandringham from central London. We'll get the very latest from that leaders' summit as well. The Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, will be giving a news conference at 5 o'clock. Back to Sam in a moment, but I want to bring in a Ukrainian voice now, if I can, and bring in Yuri Sak, who is a minister in the Ukrainian government. Yuri Sak, look, it's always good to get the time to speak with you. Thanks so much for speaking to us today. What do you want to hear from the Prime Minister when he gives that news conference later?
Thank you, Kamali. Good to be back on Sky News, and I'd like to make a small correction. I'm advisor to the minister, I'm not the minister. Advisor to the Minister of Strategic Industries of Ukraine. But as for the statements that we expect, of course, after the very tumultuous time spent by President and his team in the Oval Office, of course, we are now looking for unity on the European continent. We hope that we will find diplomatic ways to preserve and save our transatlantic unity. And going forward, we hope that this negotiating process will come back on track, and we will work together, in particular in the field of security guarantees, which even the White House said that they don't mind European countries fielding troops after the necessary negotiations are done and the agreements are put in place. So I think there's a lot we need and can and do discuss with our European partners, and we are thankful to Britain and to Keir Starmer for taking leadership in this process.
But Yuri Sak, as you'll know, you've always had unity from the majority of European member states. You did have unity from the White House as well until that election and the inauguration. Do Ukrainians feel now that they can't trust the United States?
We are focused, Kamali, on our survival, and we know that we have to, become more and more self-sufficient. This is exactly why, in the last 3 years, we have increased our defense industry output by 35 times. of course, we are still not capable of providing all the weapons that our soldiers need by ourselves. And of course, going forward, it is very difficult to see how we can cope without the US being our strategic partner. That is exactly why we will invest more diplomatic efforts into repairing what has been slightly damaged in the last couple of days. And we will rely on our European partners in helping us achieve that as well. But again, we all need to be realistic about the threat that we are facing. And it's not just Russia. We're seeing that Russia is friends with Iran, with North Korea. Russia gets a lot of weapons from those countries. Russia actually today is producing 3 times more ammunition, for example, than all of European countries taken together. So it is like everything that's happening. It's a bit of a wake-up call for all of us, and we all need to step up our efforts. Defense budgets must be increased, apparently. Defense industry must be ramped up, apparently. And we must stay united, because our unity is the most dangerous weapon that is feared by the Kremlin.
Yurisak, look, you guys have been awake since February the 22nd, 24th, 2022, haven't you? It's Europe that's now opening its eyes to all of this. You mentioned the Oval Office and what happened on Friday night. I don't know, have you spoken to Zelenskyy, President Zelenskyy, or anyone in his team about what happened on Friday yet?
I spoke to some of the people who were present in that room, and of course this was, I think for everybody, this was very unexpected. You know, the only positive thing is that during that meeting, we were not accused again of starting the war. Because apart from that, everything, which is a shame actually, and very unfortunate, because our team and, you know, President Zelenskyy, they went to the US confident that the deal on this framework deal on critical minerals will be signed, and it will move the negotiating process forward. And then, you know, it must have been one of those days when just things didn't work out well, because the American side as well confirmed. It's not that we came into the White House with this deal without them seeing it first, right? So it was discussed beforehand. Everything seemed to be fine. But then, you know, one contentious issue is ceasefire. We know that we cannot trust Russia. Russia is, you know, every time we sign a ceasefire, they violated it. We also have a bad history with the Budapest Memorandum, where, you know, 3 other countries, we gave up our nuclear weapons, and we were given security guarantees that never worked. So we know that achieving ceasefire without any security guarantees or any meaningful security architecture in place, this is going to reward Russia for their aggression. This is going to give Russia more time, and this will not ensure that Russia doesn't reinvade. Plus, nobody ever discussed yet, is Russia willing to do a ceasefire? Now, that is another question which nobody has an answer yet to.
Yeah, well, they've said that they don't want to see NATO or European troops in Ukraine, so that's something we will have to work out soon. Yurisak, look, you said that it didn't go well. You'll know that they want President Zelenskyy to apologise, should he?
As a Ukrainian, and I must tell you, Kamali, now, when President speaks on these occasions, he speaks for all of us. So, of course, it will be down to the President himself. But I don't think our President did anything wrong in that meeting. You know, he defended our interests. He tried to explain our position. He tried to stick to the facts. And it's quite frankly, I don't see what he has to apologize for.
Well, they think that he was disrespecting the office.
I don't think he was. You know, I personally, I have watched that video so many times, and I think he did really actually well, because, you know, the amount of sort of verbal attacks that he was under, you know, he kept his composure and kept his cool, you know, and we were all sitting watching this live unfold in front of our eyes, you know, and it was a difficult sight to see. But what can I say? He spoke there with dignity, because, you know, millions of Ukrainians in Ukraine, those refugees who are away from Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were watching that press conference in the trenches. And look, we tell our partners every day that to stand up to Russia, to have success in the form of just peace, we all have to be brave and strong. So our president cannot just sit there in the Oval Office quietly and, you know, eat a humble pie and not respond when he's accused of things that never happened. So, you know, all of us, we are proud of our president. We are firmly behind him. And We just believe this was one of the bad days, and it will be rectified going forward, and the parties will come back to the negotiating table soon.
Right, Yuri Sak, always good to speak with you, so thanks so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's bring in Sam Coates, our Deputy Political Editor, once again. And Sam, look, as we were speaking there to Yuri Sak, we saw some more world leaders leaving. And Yuri Sak just sort of laying out there the difficulty of all of this in terms of the relationship that some in the American establishment might want President Zelenskyy to apologise. He's not going to do that. And they just want to try and move this forward and achieve a peace.
One of President Trump's...
Peace is what everybody, I think, round the table in the London summit that you're in Lancaster House, the location that you're looking at right now, is what they want. We've just seen Olaf Scholz, the outgoing German Chancellor. He's headed out of the summit into his motorcade. We've also heard again from another European. This time it was Antonio Costa. He's the President of the European Council. He says Europe is ready to step up. But the big voice we want to hear from in the next hour, possibly delayed till about 5:15, maybe slightly later, Keir Starmer, his press conference coming, where he will set out what was talked about, what was agreed, and where this conflict goes next at this critical moment for Ukraine and the world.
Hugely critical. All right, Sam, for now, outside Lancaster House, thank you very much for that. Well, in the next hour of the programme, we will, of course, be hearing from the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, as the London summit wraps up. Summit convened of European leaders by the Prime Minister to try and work out a peace plan for Ukraine. We'll hear if there has been anything concrete decided upon when the Prime Minister speaks in the next hour. Do stay with us here on Sky News.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week, we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.